Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 stories of people who ventured into the Appalachian Mountains during the last week of October. And let's just say, things didn't go the way they expected. The final story is actually an unsolved case, and it really feels like there's been some kind of effort to cover up what actually happened. Also, just a quick heads up, I'm currently working on a special Halloween edition video, and I think it's going to be incredible. I'm super excited to share it with you all on the 31st, so make sure you've got your notifications turned on. Thank you so much for being here and for choosing to support this channel. I truly hope you enjoy this video as much as I enjoyed reading and putting these stories together. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Everything happened at the end of October 2019. My brother and I, even though we're twins and look identical, have always been very different in our tastes. And when I say different, I mean really different. If I liked rice, he liked pasta. If I liked the city, he liked the countryside, and so on. One thing about us is that we've always lived our whole lives in West Virginia with our parents. But when the time came for each of us to move out, I stayed in the city. And he literally moved to the middle of nowhere. Just forest all around. I always say he lives like a hermit in a cabin in the woods. Although, over the years, I've come to realize he actually built a kind of paradise for himself out there. Now, one thing my brother always missed was Halloween. Real Halloween. And because of that, we had this kind of deal between us. I hated Halloween. He loved it. So, during the last week of October, we'd switch houses. That way, he could enjoy Halloween in the city, go out with friends, and I could spend the night appreciating Halloween in my own way, watching horror videos and movies without anyone bothering or interrupting me. So, on October 21st, I packed everything I needed into a bag and hit the road. My brother would only leave the cabin a day after I arrived. First, because he had an old dog named Sprout. And second, because he needed to explain a bunch of stuff to me so I could survive and keep the house exactly the way he liked it. Every year, he came up with new things. That was one of his strengths. He could face any problem head-on and fix it using materials he already had. The solutions weren't always perfect, but they always worked. The thing was, each of those fixes had little tricks to make them work. And that's exactly what he had to explain to me. The drive to the cabin was always pleasant. The first part was highway, the second part smaller roads, and the last stretch was dirt, but surprisingly well kept. So it almost felt like driving on a mountain road. When I got there, Sweet Sprout was already waiting for me. When I tell you she's the sweetest, most affectionate dog that ever existed, I'm not exaggerating. She's the kind of dog that, even though she's big, wouldn't hurt a fly and is always giving kisses. Since she was rescued from abuse, I guess now that she knows what love is, she wants to spend every second of her life giving it back. Anyway, I love her. She's perfect. I'm always happy to come here and spend time with her. My brother showed up soon after, when he heard my car pull in. I got settled, we caught up, and went to bed pretty early. The next day, there was a whole list of things he needed to show me. Once everything was explained and in place, he left for the city, and I stayed alone with Sprout. The first 3 days went by just like they always did. I spent my days walking around, and sometimes, when the trails were short, I took Sprout with me. Even though she was already 16, she could still handle and even enjoyed short hikes. At night, I'd put on some horror videos on YouTube or watch horror movies. On the 4th night, that's when I noticed something a little strange for the first time. I was outside. It was already dark, and I had made a small fire. I could have lit the fireplace inside, but I felt like pretending I was camping, so I made a small campfire outside. That's when I noticed Sprout staring fixedly at a spot. No matter how much I called her, even pretending I had food, she wouldn't move. She just stayed frozen, looking in that direction. No matter how much I looked, I couldn't see anything. It was too dark, and the trees were dense. It could have been an animal. In fact, that's what I thought it was. But still, the discomfort was enough to make me decide to go back inside and lock everything up. Then, I just forgot about it, turned on the TV, and tried to distract myself a little. Around 10:30, I heard a noise coming from the front of the house. Even though Sprout was half deaf, she also reacted. Her ears perked up right away. I went to the window and saw that there really was someone walking toward the house. I went straight to the door and opening just the small window the door had, and asked who it was. The man on the other side looked completely normal, ordinary even. But Sprout was restless. I could feel her pacing back and forth at my feet. That was something she never did. She didn't get anxious with visitors. She got excited. For her to be anxious, something was definitely wrong. The man didn't answer my question right away. He just got closer, and then finally spoke. He said he was camping nearby but had gotten lost and needed help. Then he asked a question that made me instantly suspicious. Besides Sprout's reaction, he asked if I lived alone. Obviously, I wasn't about to tell him I was alone. So I said no, that I lived with my brother and that some friends were arriving soon to spend a few days. I told him maybe after that we could help him find his camp. I asked if he wanted a glass of water, and he said no. Then he asked if he could come inside. The whole interaction was extremely strange. I told him no, that it was nighttime. But if he needed something, I could pass it through the door window. He said no, and started walking away toward the trees. That's when, while watching him leave, I noticed something that froze me. There was at least one more person hiding among the trees. I caught some movement and, looking closely, could distinguish a body. I closed the peephole and tried to think as calmly as I could in that kind of situation. It would have been fine if it was just one man. But two? That was double my size, and that made me uneasy. I called my brother and asked if that had ever happened before. And that's when he said no, but that he'd had a few weird encounters in that area before, and because of that, he had a panic room built in the basement. That made me feel slightly safer, but still, I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I checked all the doors and windows, then went back to the couch. There was still no reason to panic. Everything was fine, as long as they stayed outside. I kept watching the movie, and then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to Sprout licking me compulsively. I asked her what was wrong, rhetorically of course, but I could tell she was anxious. Something was definitely happening. Then everything happened too fast. I heard a noise that seemed to come from the small balcony upstairs, near the bedrooms, and then a shattering sound. The window had been broken. Without thinking twice, I grabbed Sprout, my phone, and ran to the basement where the panic room was. From outside, I could hear things breaking and people talking. There was no doubt there were more than one, and from what it sounded like, more than two. Obviously, I called the police. They told me it would take a while to reach that area. That's exactly why my brother had that room built. He knew that if something ever went really wrong, he could never count on the police to arrive in time. It was better to be prepared. When the police finally arrived, the house was completely trashed and several things were missing. The strangest part was that one of the men was still there, locked in one of the rooms with a gunshot wound in his leg. Actually, he wasn't really a man. He was clearly a kid. When he started talking, that's when we understood the full picture. He belonged to a group that robbed remote and isolated areas all over the country. He had joined the group when he was only 12, after both his parents died. He believed the group would protect him. They had promised that. But as he grew older, the robberies became more violent, and more than once, someone ended up dead or badly beaten. He had tried to run away several times but couldn't. When they heard the sirens in the distance, he realized this was his only chance. He had tried to barricade himself in one of the rooms, but one of the men saw him and shot him in an attempt to shut him up. The door to the room he was in had almost been kicked down, probably because they wanted to get him before the police arrived. But the police got there fast, and the group had to flee, leaving him behind. To this day, nothing else is known about the group. The trial is still ongoing, and it seems like they either went quiet for a while or completely changed locations. My brother still lives in that house, and Sprout is still alive. But now, he has a full alarm system with cameras, and the panic room is a lot more sophisticated than it was in 2019. I just hope he never has to use it. And as for me, I'm not going back to that area anytime soon, especially not alone. Everything happened in late October of 2002. I'd been planning that camping trip for months. Something simple, just a few days alone in the Smoky Mountains to disconnect from everything. I'd been working too many hours, sleeping too little. And honestly, I needed to feel like a human being again. I guess that's probably the reason most of us decide to do these things. It's because cities, as fantastic as they might be, are also absolutely suffocating. I had done similar trips before, but this one felt different right from the start, and I still can't explain exactly why. Maybe the isolation was more complete, or maybe it was because I already had a few monkeys running around in my head. The Smoky Mountains are without a doubt a hotspot for strange things happening, and even though I didn't want those stories to stop me from going, I still had a bit of fear about what I might find. I left Knoxville early in the morning with my gear in the back of the truck. My plan was to drive up to a small, somewhat hidden campground that a coworker had told me about. A place not many people knew, which, at the time, sounded perfect. I wanted quiet and complete silence. The road was calm at first, just endless trees on both sides. The closer I got, the fewer houses I saw. Eventually my phone signal disappeared, but I didn't care. I had my satellite phone, so I still had a way to contact someone if I needed to. I felt like I was finally where I wanted to be. When I arrived, there was no one else around. Not a single car, not a tent, nothing. The campground wasn't official, just a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by forest. I parked the truck and started setting up camp. Tent, fire ring, food bag hanging high from a tree branch. All the usual things. By the time I finished, it was already late afternoon. I made a small fire, heated some canned soup, and sat watching the sky turn from blue to orange, then to black. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. Until that moment when I heard something. It wasn't an animal. I know what a raccoon or a deer sounds like. This was slower, heavier, like a person walking. The sounds came from the other side of the creek, maybe 30 feet away, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. At first, I thought it might be another camper, so I called out, "Hey, someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped for a few seconds, then started again. Slower this time, as if whoever, or whatever, didn't want to be noticed. I tried to relax. There was still no reason to worry. I had a way to contact someone and a way to protect myself if I really needed to. I threw a few more logs onto the fire. Even though it didn't sound like an animal, it still could have been, and a brighter fire meant fewer animals nearby. I sat awake until almost midnight before finally convincing myself to sleep. I hadn't heard absolutely anything else for at least 2 hours, so I convinced myself it had been an animal, and that it was all just in my head. The next morning, everything looked perfectly normal. I made coffee, packed a small bag, and went for a short hike up the ridge behind the campsite. It was peaceful and quiet, and at that time of year, absolutely beautiful. I came back around noon and noticed something strange. My cooler was open. Not just unzipped, open, like someone had gone through it. Nothing was missing, but the ice inside had melted faster than it should have. The lid was propped against the tent as if someone had placed it there on purpose. I looked around, trying to see if there were footprints, but the ground was covered in dry leaves. Clearly, someone had been there. So I packed everything into the truck and just left. That's what my instincts told me to do, so I obeyed. A few miles up the road, there was another campsite, so I decided to go there instead. I could even get to it by car. The road was rougher, which was why the campsite was barely used anymore. That night, I didn't light a fire. I just sat in the tent with a small flashlight, reading a book. I felt a little uneasy after being somewhere where someone had gone through my things. But still, there was no reason to worry here. I was far from the previous campsite. Around 10, I woke up suddenly. I don't know exactly why I woke up, but all at once it felt like the air inside the tent had become suffocating. I stepped outside, and in a completely instinctive movement, I grabbed my phone and my car keys. I didn't know why, but something felt wrong. I looked around, trying to make out the shapes in the dark. And that's when I saw a small light coming from the trees. Something almost invisible. So small and distant. But it was definitely a light, and it was moving. Someone was there, watching me, and smoking. Then, in a quick motion, I saw the cigarette being flicked to the ground and stomped out. I started running toward the car. and as I did, I heard the most terrifying sound you can ever hear in the middle of nowhere. A gunshot. I didn't even know if I'd been hit or not. The adrenaline was that intense. I jumped into the car, shaking and terrified that whoever it was might have done something to keep it from starting. But no, it worked perfectly. And within less than a minute, I was speeding down the road. Only when I was finally out of those mountains and back on the main road did I feel like I could breathe again and try to figure out if I'd been shot. Obviously, I hadn't. Otherwise, my body would have gone into shock much sooner. But the adrenaline was so strong, and I felt like I'd been so close to something going horribly wrong, that everything that happened afterward felt like an out-of-body experience. Of course, I contacted the authorities and explained what had happened. I later found out that about 3 years earlier, a man had gone missing there. There were signs of a struggle, and his body had been found several miles from the campsite, but he'd been shot in the leg. The theory was that he probably managed to escape, but alone and without any resources in the mountains, he eventually died. The simple thought of something like that happening to me completely froze me inside. Since then, several years have passed, and I've never camped in places like that again. I haven't stopped hiking or camping, but I've never done it anywhere except clearly marked areas filled with other people. What I'm about to tell you happened in late October of 2021, at a time in my life when I felt like things were finally starting to fall into place. I had no idea how wrong I was, or how obsessive my life would become after that weekend. I'd taken a long weekend off to clear my head, something I used to do at least once a year. I packed my gear, threw it in the trunk, and drove out to the Smoky Mountains early Friday morning. I didn't have any specific destination in mind, just a marked trail where I could hike for a few miles and camp near one of the creeks. I'd read somewhere that this time of year was perfect for it. The leaves were turning, the air was crisp, and the crowds had already disappeared. At first, both my wife and my daughter were supposed to go with me. But my wife was going through a stressful time at work and wanted to stay home. My daughter had a birthday party that same weekend, so I ended up going alone. Either way, it was only for 2 days. One thing about me is that I'm not the kind of person who says no easily. Never have been. It's something that's caused me more problems than I can count. I say yes to things I don't want to do. Help people who clearly take advantage of me, and end up in situations I don't even know how to leave without feeling like a jerk. It's not pride. It's fear of confrontation. That kind of trait might seem harmless, but that weekend, it almost cost me everything. The first few hours of the trip went smoothly. The hike was beautiful, the weather perfect. And by late afternoon, I had my tent up by the edge of the water. I made a small fire, cooked some noodles, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. There was that kind of silence that's both peaceful and heavy at the same time. I remember thinking it felt good to be away from everything, even from people. I love my family more than words can express. But sometimes a weekend away is pure therapy. Sometime after dark, maybe around 8, I heard someone walking on the trail behind me. At first, I assumed it was another hiker passing through. But the steps didn't keep going. They stopped near the edge of my camp. I turned my head and saw a man standing there. Maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket and a beanie. He raised his hands slightly like he wanted to look harmless. He started talking right away, his voice calm, saying I didn't need to worry, that he wasn't some kind of creep. I could tell he was trying to sound casual, but something about the whole situation felt off. He said he was doing a study on people who camped alone in the Smokies. He claimed it was part of a research project. How people prepared, what gear they brought, how they communicated in case of emergencies. He told me it would only take a minute, and then he'd leave. I didn't want to talk to him. Everything in me screamed to tell him to go away. But, like always, I couldn't. I didn't want to sound rude. I nodded and said it was fine for him to ask his questions. That was my mistake. At first, it sounded innocent enough. He asked if I'd hiked this trail before, if I felt safe camping alone, if I ever told anyone where I was going. But then the question started to shift in a way that made my stomach tighten. He asked if anyone knew I was there at that moment. If I had a satellite phone or any kind of tracking device. If someone was expecting to hear from me that night. If I had a weapon. If I usually camped alone or with friends. The more he asked, the clearer it became that this wasn't about research. He wasn't taking notes. Didn't have any kind of badge or equipment. Just an old backpack and that same calm, empty expression. The questions felt calculated, almost rehearsed. It was like he was checking off a list in his head, trying to figure out exactly how invisible I was. I tried to keep my voice steady, answering honestly at first, then lying when I realized what he might be doing. I said yes to questions I should have said no to, pretending I was less alone than I actually was. I kept hoping that if I just played along, he'd leave. But the more I talked, the more he stayed. At one point, he shifted his body slightly, and the flashlight beam caught something inside his jacket. A handle, dark and metallic. It looked like a large hunting knife. My mouth went dry instantly. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just strange. He was dangerous. I told him, as calmly as I could, that I had some equipment near my tent I could show him. Something for navigation, something interesting for his study. I took a few steps back, pretending I was heading toward the tent. But instead, I turned toward the trail. I walked as naturally as I could at first. Then, when I was sure he couldn't see me clearly anymore, I started running. I didn't look back. I just ran. The ground was uneven, branches hitting my face, the beam of my headlamp bouncing wildly. I could feel my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The only thing I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between me and that man. I didn't stop until I reached the start of the trail, where the small gravel parking area was. My car was still there. I got inside and locked the doors before I could even catch my breath. One thing I always do, and something I think is really important, is keep a small bag attached to my waist, or somewhere comfortable at all times, even while I sleep. Inside, I keep the essentials. My phone, 1 or 2 energy bars, a water purifier, car keys, a flashlight, and some form of self-defense. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to get into the car. There was a ranger station about 2 miles down the road, and that's where I went. I told them everything. What happened, what he said, the questions, the knife. They listened, took notes, and told me to stay calm. Then one of them stepped out to make a call. When he came back, his expression had changed. He told me that just a few hours earlier, a woman had shown up at another station, terrified, saying she and her husband had been attacked by a man in the woods. According to her, the man had first approached them pretending to be doing some kind of survey, asking questions that made her uneasy. Later that night, he came back. She managed to escape, but her husband was still out there hurt, or dead. The description matched him exactly. The blood drained from my face. I realized I had been next. If I hadn't run when I did, I probably wouldn't have made it out. Then another man walked into the room, possibly a supervisor, and gave him a look that left no doubt in either of our minds. He had said too much. I took the opportunity to say I was going to get some air and immediately got into the car. The weight of what they had just told me gave me what I think was a mild panic attack and kept me from thinking clearly. I didn't even think about going back for my gear. I drove straight home that night without stopping, and for days I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the news, expecting to see something. An arrest, a report, anything. But nothing ever came up. No updates, no mention of the woman, not even a police statement. After a few weeks, I tried contacting the park rangers again to ask about the investigation. But they said there was no record of any incident like that. No reports, no witnesses, nothing. I even drove back to the same area almost a year later to look for answers. Most of the people I talked to didn't know what I was referring to. But one ranger, an older guy, gave me a stare that made my skin tingle. He told me to forget about it, not in a casual way, but with a tone that felt like a warning. That was the last time I went near those mountains. It's been 2 years, and I still have no answers. No proof, no records. Sometimes I think about how easily it all could have ended differently, just because I couldn't say no. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I've always had a hobby most people find a little disturbing and scary. I'm obsessed with folklore. Not the fairy tale, Disney clean kind. I mean the stuff people whisper about when it's late and nobody wants to sound crazy. Especially folklore tied to sound, noises in the woods, voices where there shouldn't be voices, patterns people swear they heard but can't prove. It's not that I believe any of it is real. That's the thing people always get wrong. I don't go looking for monsters. I go looking for the moment where something unexplained happens, and instead of saying, "I don't know," people build entire mythologies around it. That's what fascinates me, that exact point where confusion turns into story. The truth behind the stories, that's what I chase. So when my friend Peter told me his uncle had a lake house out in the Appalachians and asked if I wanted to tag along for a few days, I didn't hesitate. He framed it like a break, a mini vacation. Fresh air, no signal, just chill. But for me, it was something else entirely. The Appalachians are probably one of my favorite places in the world. It's where the legends are everywhere, the monsters are even bigger, and the number of people who disappear every year or come back with surreal, impossible stories is a lot. I couldn't contain my excitement and said yes immediately, without even thinking twice. After that, I spent days and days locked in my basement, trying to figure out which story I was going to investigate this time. And when I found it, I couldn't have been happier. People around there have a phrase they don't like to explain. The hills have eyes. No one says it jokingly, and that's the detail that hooked me. The drive out there ended up taking longer than I had originally expected. Not because we got lost or anything as simple as that. The GPS technically worked the entire time. But because the roads gradually began to be more challenging, as if we were being guided away from places rather than toward them, with gas stations becoming fewer and farther between, houses turning into trailers and then into nothing at all, until all that remained were endless stretches of dense forest pressing in on both sides of the road so tightly that it almost felt like the sky itself was being swallowed. It's a magical place indeed. Peter didn't seem to notice any of it, or if he did, he didn't care enough to comment, since he spent most of the drive blasting music and talking about completely normal things like fishing, beer, and girls. The kind of grounded, everyday conversation that almost felt out of place against the backdrop of where we were going. While I found myself increasingly distracted, watching the tree line more than the road ahead. At one point, more out of curiosity than anything else, I reached over and turned the music down a bit and asked him, in a half-joking tone that didn't fully hide my interest, whether he had ever heard anything strange out in these parts. To which he immediately laughed and asked me to define what I meant by strange. When I clarified that I was talking about voices or sounds in the woods that didn't quite make sense, he gave me a look that suggested he was already regretting bringing me along, before telling me that his uncle's neighbors were the kind of people who would happily fill my head with all sorts of old stories if I asked them, which, whether he realized it or not, was exactly what I had been hoping for. When we finally arrived, the lake house turned out to be even better than I had imagined, sitting slightly elevated above the ground and overlooking a stretch of water so still and dark that, by the time we got there, it almost looked black, with no other houses visible nearby and no artificial light sources to break up the darkness. Just trees surrounding the property on all sides in a way that made it feel less like a clearing and more like a temporary interruption in the forest. It was genuinely stunning. Peter slipped into vacation mode almost immediately, giving me a quick tour, handing me a beer, and settling into the kind of relaxed mindset people come out here for. I tried to follow his lead, I really did, sitting on the porch and listening to the insects while watching the faint movement of the lake's surface. But even then, I could only think about everything I'd read at home and all the places nearby that I wanted to see. He must have noticed the look on my face, because he laughed and said I was always the same old me. That night, I was talking to Peter, explaining that there were a few places I wanted to check out the next day. Asking if he wanted to come with me, or if he preferred to stay by the lake and just relax, since that was the whole point of being there anyway. And at first he said he'd come, seemed interested even. But later that evening, things shifted a bit. We were sitting in the living room when his uncle arrived. He had been working in a nearby village and decided to come spend the evening with us instead of staying at his place there. which he usually did during the week. The conversation started casually enough, just small talk, until it turned toward the area, the forest, the kind of things people say about it. He mentioned that there were stories, a lot of them actually, about strange sounds at night. Things people hear deep in the trees that don't quite match anything familiar, and depending on who you ask, those sounds mean different things. Some people say it's just wildlife. Others believe the forest carries unnatural sounds. But there are also those who insist it's something else entirely, something that communicates in ways we don't fully understand. He talked about people who believe the forest is full of spirits, that at night they move, that they interact, that what you hear isn't random. And then he mentioned something more specific, a kind of local story about a woman dressed in black who is sometimes seen moving between the trees, not approaching, not speaking, just present. I'd already heard and read about that legend countless times, but honestly, it always struck me as one of the more far-fetched ones. Everyone had a different version, and there was no real consensus. People were probably seeing something similar and unsettling, but everything else felt like it had been made up to fit the story. At least, that's what I thought. Then his uncle said something that really caught my attention. He mentioned an old transmission station, abandoned for years, sitting deeper in the forest, about an hour's walk from the house, completely isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and uneven ground. The kind of place you wouldn't stumble upon by accident. He said that when he was younger, not long after it had been deactivated, he had gone there once, maybe twice, and that he had heard sounds inside, strange ones, the kind that at the time he assumed came from people living there. Because it's not uncommon for abandoned structures in remote areas to be used by people who choose to live off the grid, away from everything else. Still, he admitted that it had unsettled him enough that he never went back. I had spent time looking into the area before coming, reading what I could, checking maps, trying to find anything worth exploring. And I had never come across any mention of that station, not even a vague reference, which made it feel less like a known location and more like something overlooked, something that existed just outside of what people usually pay attention to. So, after his uncle left us for the night, I told Peter that I wanted to go there the next day, that I was genuinely curious. He hesitated, said he might come, but that he'd decide in the morning, which I understood, because not everyone is comfortable with places like that, especially when they're isolated and abandoned. I told him there was no pressure, that he could stay by the lake if he preferred, enjoy the day, and I'd go on my own, because at that point, I was more interested than cautious. Looking back, I think I underestimated that. The next morning, I woke up excited in a way that now feels a bit naive, like I was focused entirely on the idea of exploring something unknown without really considering what that might involve. And I set out early, following the path as best as I could. The walk itself is quiet, almost peaceful, the kind of calm that makes you forget how far you are from everything else. It wasn't until I was maybe a mile away that I saw it, rising above the trees. The structure itself, tall, with a tower that stood out against the sky in a way that made it immediately clear how exposed and isolated it was. Even from that distance, there was something about it that didn't feel inviting. Still, I kept going. When I got closer, I saw that the area was fenced off, though parts of the fence had been cut or bent, enough to suggest that others had been there before, which reassured me slightly, because it meant I wasn't the only one curious enough to come this far. But the moment I touched the metal, I heard something behind me. It came from the direction of the trees, not loud, but distinct enough that I turned immediately, because I hadn't seen anyone on the way there, and the idea that something, or someone, was nearby without me noticing was enough to make me pause. At first I thought it might be an animal, which in itself was a concern given where I was. But there was something about the sound that didn't quite match that, something closer to movement you'd associate with a person. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether I was overreacting. And even though nothing else followed, the feeling stayed. That awareness that I wasn't as alone as I had assumed. Even so, I climbed through the opening in the fence and went in. And that's where things stopped making sense in a way that I can't fully explain even now, because almost as soon as I stepped into those structures, into what used to be rooms, corridors, sections of the station, I lost my sense of direction completely. At first it didn't seem serious, just a matter of unfamiliar layout, different levels, uneven ground. But the more I moved, the less certain I became about where I had come from, where the exits were, how everything connected, and what started as curiosity slowly turned into something closer to concern. There were windows, but not always where I needed them, sometimes too high to be useful, other times blocked or positioned in a way that didn't help orient me. And I found myself moving from one space to another, trying to piece together a mental map that never quite formed. For a while, I told myself it was manageable, that I just needed to slow down, retrace my steps. But as time passed, I became more aware of the risks, the instability of the structures, the possibility of weak floors, collapsing sections, the kind of hazards that make abandoned places genuinely dangerous if you're not careful. And then there was the light that gradually, and without me noticing at first, started to fade. I could tell from the upper levels, from the way the brightness shifted, from the shadows stretching differently across the walls. And with that came a growing urgency, because being inside that place during daylight was one thing, but being there after dark with no clear way out was something else entirely. I moved faster, then slower again, trying not to make mistakes, trying to stay aware of where I stepped, but at the same time feeling that pressure building, that sense that I needed to find a way out before it was too late. But as I went deeper, from corridor to corridor, from one section to another, I realized that I no longer had any clear idea of which direction led outside. And that's when it started to feel less like exploring and more like being really stuck. At that point, I could feel the shift in myself very clearly, because up until then, I had still been trying to approach the situation as something I could manage, something I could solve by staying calm and thinking it through. But gradually, that gave way to something else entirely, something much closer to desperation, because the more I moved through those corridors and those rooms without finding a way out, the more aware I became that night was approaching, and I had no reliable way of leaving that place before it got completely dark. So my focus changed from trying to get out immediately to trying to find somewhere I could stay without putting myself in even more danger. Somewhere enclosed, stable enough. Somewhere that would at least give me a sense of protection against whatever might move through that structure during the night. Eventually, I came across a space that seemed more suitable than the others. A small room with 4 walls and a low ceiling, almost tucked away within the rest of the structure. And the way it was positioned made it feel, at least in that moment, like I could remain there without being easily seen, as if it offered a kind of concealment that the more open areas did not. It also seemed to be on a slightly higher level compared to where I had been before, and I remember thinking that if anything entered from the lower parts of the building, whether animals or otherwise, it would take longer to reach me there, which at the time felt like a small but important advantage. Even though in reality, I had no way of knowing how true that was. The truth is, I had never been in a situation like that before. Completely alone, deep in a forest, inside an abandoned structure, with no clear sense of direction and no guarantee of being able to leave when I wanted to. And even before it got fully dark, I was already frightened in a way I hadn't expected. A kind of fear that settles and becomes difficult to ignore. But what I didn't realize then was that it would get significantly worse once the light was gone. At first, it was subtle, something I almost dismissed as my imagination adjusting to the silence. But from somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls, beyond the immediate space I was in, I began to hear what sounded like voices. Faint and irregular. The kind of sound that you instinctively try to interpret as human because that's the closest reference you have. And yet, from the very first moment I heard them, I knew, with a kind of certainty that didn't require reasoning, that they were not people. Because there was something about the way the sound carried, the way it seemed to move through the space, that didn't align with anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't just that I couldn't understand what was being said, it was that the sound itself didn't behave like speech. It felt closer to whispering, but without the structure of words, like fragments of something that almost resembled language, but never fully formed into it. As time passed, that sound didn't remain distant. It grew closer in a way that made it feel as though the space itself was closing in, as though whatever was producing that sound was moving through the structure without following the same paths I had been using. And I could feel my body reacting before I had time to process it. My heart racing, my breathing becoming shallow, that instinctive awareness that something was approaching even if I couldn't see it. And then it became too much. There wasn't a specific moment where I made a conscious decision. It was more like my body acted on its own. And I stood up and started running, without any real sense of direction, without knowing if I was moving toward an exit or deeper into the structure. At that point, the only thing that mattered was putting distance between myself and whatever I felt was getting closer. I was completely disoriented. Every corridor looked similar to the last. Every turn felt uncertain. And I knew, even as I was running, that I might be making things worse, that I might be getting myself more lost. But stopping didn't feel like an option. And that's when I heard a voice, clearer than the others, distinct in a way that immediately set it apart. And what unsettled me most about it wasn't just that it sounded human, but that it sounded familiar. So much so that I had the almost immediate impression that I was hearing my own voice, calling out from somewhere ahead, telling me to come that way. I can't explain how that would even be possible, and even now it doesn't make sense when I try to think about it logically. But in that moment, it didn't feel like something I needed to question. It felt like something I needed to follow. Through the dim light, through the shifting shadows, I thought I could see the outline of a figure ahead, indistinct. And everything happened very quickly after that. So quickly that I can't clearly separate one moment from the next. I followed that voice. Not because I had a reason to trust it, but because something about it felt like the only direction that led out. And within what must have been less than 10 minutes, though it felt longer at the time, I found myself outside, standing in the forest, the air different, the space open again. And almost immediately, my sense of direction returned. As if something that had been interfering with it simply stopped the moment I crossed that threshold. I didn't stop to question it. I kept running through the forest toward the lake house, retracing the path as best as I could, moving as fast as I was able, until I saw the house by the lake in the distance, lights on. When I got closer, I realized they were already outside. Peter and his uncle, both of them clearly on edge, already prepared to come looking for me. By the time I reached them, the relief I felt was almost overwhelming, and I could see the same in them, that shared recognition that something had gone wrong, even before I said anything. When I finally explained what had happened, or at least tried to, because even then I couldn't fully articulate it, I noticed something in his uncle's expression that I didn't expect. Not disbelief and not confusion, but something closer to recognition, like he understood more than he was saying. Peter, on the other hand, was uncertain, somewhere between skeptical and unsettled, which I don't blame him for, because I know how it sounds. But he also knows me well enough to know that I don't invent things like that. That if anything, I tend to look for explanations rather than jump to conclusions. Still, I could tell they both saw how shaken I was. Not just from the fear of getting lost in that structure, which was real enough on its own, but from everything that came with it. The loss of orientation, the sounds, the voice, the fact that none of it behaved in a way I could understand or rationalize. After that, we stayed there for the rest of the trip, but I wasn't the same for the remaining days, not really present in the way I had been before. More like I was going through the motions, aware of everything, but unable to fully engage with it. Even being by the lake, which should have been relaxing, even with them trying to keep things light, I couldn't shake that feeling, that sense that something had happened that I hadn't fully grasped. I've tried to think about it since then, to find some explanation. And there are theories, things people talk about, like magnetic fields affecting perception, altering your sense of direction or time, especially in mountainous areas. But even if that explains part of it, it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the voice. It doesn't explain the way the space seemed to distort. It doesn't explain why I couldn't find my way out of something that, on paper, shouldn't have been impossible to navigate. I never went back, and I won't. Whatever that place is, whatever exists within it or around it, it was enough for me to understand that some things aren't meant to be explored alone. And if anyone ever decides to go there, knowing what I've just told you, then at the very least, don't make the mistake I did. Don't go by yourself. Don't assume you'll be able to find your way out just because you found your way in. And if something tells you to leave, don't wait to understand why.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
This all happened when I was a teenager. Well, not even a teenager yet, really. I was around 12, maybe 13. I'm not exactly sure, but it was somewhere in that range. I grew up in the city. I lived in Lakewood until I was about 11. And then my parents decided that staying there just wasn't sustainable anymore with what they were making. It had gotten too expensive, too demanding. And so we moved to where my grandparents were originally from, West Virginia. Right up against the Appalachian Mountains, deep forest, real isolation. I hadn't really spent time in the mountains before that. Honestly, I barely even visited my grandparents growing up. And when I did, we almost never left the house. So going from a city environment to something that rural, that quiet, that cut off, it hit me hard. There wasn't the same group of kids I knew. My parents were more stressed than usual because of money, and I could feel it, even if they didn't say it out loud. It was one of those changes that just lands on you all at once, and you're expected to adapt without anyone really explaining what's going on. They didn't have much emotional bandwidth to walk me through it. I didn't feel close to my grandparents, didn't even really see them as part of my life. I didn't know the forest, didn't understand the risks, didn't know what to be careful about. So, yeah, it was rough. And it all happened right at that stage of life where everything inside you starts shifting. Hormones, emotions, identity, stuff you don't fully understand yet and don't really know how to talk about, even if you wanted to. All of that combined pushed me toward a group of kids from the area. The kind that were always looking for trouble. I think, looking back, it was my way of getting attention. Any kind of reaction from my parents, really. And what I'm about to tell you happened one night because of that. There was this one guy in the group, Caleb. He was probably the most reckless out of all of us. The kind of kid who always had to take things one step further, just to prove something. Once I started hanging around them, I realized there were all these stories people told about the forest, about the mountains. I didn't really believe most of it, but I was still a kid, and some of it got under my skin more than I'd like to admit. One of the ways we proved we weren't kids anymore, that we were tough, that we were real men, or whatever we thought that meant, was by pushing deeper into the mountains. Near where I still live today, there's this massive network of caves. Some natural, some clearly man-made. Just a lot of them, scattered through the area. And caves were always considered the worst. It's easy to get lost in them, really easy. You take one wrong turn and suddenly you can't find your way back out. On top of that, a lot of animals use them for shelter. And then there were the stories, things people swore lived in there. I never saw proof of that, but the stories were always there. And then there was the more realistic side of it. People who didn't exactly live by the rules, people on the margins, use those caves too. Not always for anything good. When I was younger, there were even groups using them to cook drugs, hiding out where no one would stumble across them by accident. So, yeah, not exactly the kind of place you go for fun. But Caleb started daring people to go with him, and I was the only one in the group who still had something to prove. I was the new kid, the easy target. They were always messing with me, and I felt it. Felt like I had to earn my place somehow. So I didn't hesitate. I said I wasn't scared, said I'd go. That same night, I waited until my parents went to sleep. Around 11:30, once the house was completely quiet, once I was sure my dad had taken his sleeping pills and my mom was out, I opened my bedroom window and slipped out as quietly as I could. I headed to where Caleb and I had agreed to meet. That alone should have been enough to make me turn back. The forest was pitch black, not just dark, dense. My flashlight barely cut through it. The beam felt weak, swallowed up almost immediately. And I could feel it building inside me. That kind of fear that doesn't come from a clear thought, just this steady pressure in your chest. Still, I kept going. I told myself I had to do this, that this was what it took to finally fit in. I started walking faster, trying to distract myself by making up little stories in my head, anything to avoid focusing on what was around me. When I finally saw Caleb in the distance, I felt this wave of relief. I didn't even like the guy much. Not then, not now. He still lives around here, and we still see each other sometimes, but there's always been something strange between us. I think whatever happened that night stripped away that whole tough kid image we both had, and neither of us really forgot that. But at that moment, seeing him standing there, I was just glad I wasn't alone anymore. From there, we started heading toward the cave. I had no idea where we were going. I just followed him. He kept saying he'd been there plenty of times, that I didn't need to worry, that everything would be fine. But then he'd switch it up, casually mention that he'd run into people inside before, which completely contradicted what he'd just said. Obviously, that didn't help. The last thing I wanted was to run into anyone down there. We kept walking until we reached the entrance, and I almost turned back right there. I was really scared. It was too dark, too quiet, and I had no idea where I was anymore. I wanted out, but that was the problem. I didn't know how to get back. I needed Caleb for that. He was the only one who knew the way. I asked him if he was sure we should go in. He just looked at me and asked if I was already getting scared, said it in this mocking tone that hit me right in the gut. And just like that, I felt it again, that need to prove something. I couldn't back out now, not in front of him. So I said, yeah, we could go in. We'd been inside the cave for maybe a minute when I started noticing something was different. Any light from outside, the moon, anything, was gone completely. That part made sense. What didn't make sense was the flashlight. It should have felt stronger in there. The darker the space, the more a light stands out, right? But it didn't. It was like the darkness had weight to it, like it absorbed the beam instead of letting it spread. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. The walls were there, sure, wet, uneven rock, but if I pointed the light forward, all I saw was this narrow stretch of damp ground, and then nothing, just a tunnel that disappeared into black. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see beyond it. At that point, I had no idea how long we'd been inside the cave. I think in a way, I was so scared, like truly terrified, that I lost any sense of time, of distance, of what was actually happening around me. It all felt unreal. I'd never felt that kind of fear before, not even close. I remember grabbing Caleb and telling him, I want to go back. I want out of here now. And when I looked at him, I could see it on his face. He was just as scared as I was. I don't think he had ever actually been inside that cave before, at least not like that, not at night. Because the atmosphere in there was overwhelming. Heavy, like it was pressing down on you, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Then, off to our right, there was a split in the cave. A narrow passage branching off, and we heard something. Without even thinking, both of us turned off our flashlights at the exact same time. It was almost instinctive. I can't even explain why we did that. Maybe a normal reaction would have been to point the light toward the sound, but somehow we both just knew there was something, or someone, there. And the last thing we wanted was to be seen. But what happened next was worse. I don't know if it was a person, but it had to be, right? It had to be. Still, the voice didn't sound right. It was rough, strained, like it was scraping its way out of someone's throat. Not natural, not normal. And yet, we understood it perfectly. It said, "Turning off the flashlight won't help. I see you better in the dark." We both just lost it, started screaming. No hesitation, no thinking, just pure panic. And honestly, I don't even know how to describe what came after. I feel like in any other situation, I might have just frozen or blacked out from fear. But the adrenaline hit so hard, and Caleb was yelling as much as I was, that we kind of fed off each other's panic and just ran. No plan and no clear direction, just ran until we saw the cave entrance again. And even after we got out, we didn't stop. We kept going, faster than I thought I was even capable of. Not looking back, not slowing down, just putting as much distance as possible between us and that place. We didn't stop until we were about halfway back, completely out of breath. I asked him if he was okay, what the hell that even was. He said he didn't know. Said maybe it was someone living in the caves, someone sleeping in there. But I could tell, he had no idea. We didn't have an explanation. We just knew what we heard, and that was enough. After we caught our breath, we kept moving. Faster this time, but more controlled. We didn't stop again until we reached my house, and we didn't even hesitate. We went straight to my window, climbed inside, and stayed in my room the rest of the night. We just sat there, talking in low voices, going over it again and again, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. The weirdest part is, Caleb was exactly the kind of person who would have told everyone. He would have turned it into a story, something to brag about, proof that we went through something intense and made it out. But that night, he was different. He was just as shaken as I was. And without really saying it outright, we both understood. We weren't going to talk about it, not to anyone. And we didn't. To this day, we've never brought it up again. I've talked about this with a few people over the years, and I'm pretty sure Caleb has too, but never anyone from back then. Never anyone from that circle. And never anyone who might actually believe that what we heard that night was anything more than just some drifter using the caves as a place to stay. Because that's the easy explanation, right? Someone living down there. Someone who didn't want to be found. But the truth is, the way it spoke didn't sound human. Not fully. Not the way a person's voice is supposed to carry, even in a place like that. And still, what else could it have been? There's no other explanation. Maybe if that happened to me now, as an adult, I'd react differently. Maybe I wouldn't panic the same way. Maybe I'd shine the flashlight straight at whoever, or whatever that was. Or maybe I wouldn't. I honestly don't know. All I know is that back then, it was the most terrifying moment of my life. And in some way, it stuck with me. Ever since that night, I've never been fully comfortable in the dark. I wouldn't say I'm outright afraid of it, but I can't do complete darkness anymore. I always need at least a little bit of light, just enough to make out shapes, outlines, something. I've always been someone who loves exploring caves. I know that, for most people, it probably sounds like a strange hobby, maybe even a little unsettling, and I get that. But I've never really had a genuine fear of tight spaces, or darkness, or any of the things people usually associate with caves. So for me, exploring them isn't stressful. It's something that actually brings me a real sense of excitement, even purpose. Over the years, I've met more and more people who feel the same way, people who are passionate about it, who genuinely love what they do. And because of that, I've been doing it more and more often. The story I'm about to tell you actually started with one of those people. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Appalachian Mountains almost feel like they exist in layers. There's the surface level, which is already unsettling on its own. You've probably heard that it's one of the regions in the US with a high number of disappearances and events that are, frankly, hard to explain. But beneath that, there's an entire underground system of caves. It's almost like a second mountain range, hidden below the first. These caves connect to each other through an enormous network of passages. So many, in fact, that fully mapping or exploring them is basically impossible. Most of the time, you don't even find the same cave twice. There's always something new, something different. I don't know how familiar you are with these cave systems, but just to give you some grounding, what runs beneath the Appalachian Mountains isn't just a scattering of isolated caverns. It's part of an immense karst landscape carved over hundreds of millions of years, where slightly acidic groundwater dissolved layers of limestone and left behind a labyrinth of tunnels, shafts, and hidden chambers that, in some regions, stretch for miles without interruption. Places like Mammoth Cave, the longest cave system ever mapped, are only the visible fraction of something much larger and far less understood. Because for every documented passage, there are countless others that collapse, flood, or simply vanish into tight, unmapped voids. Historically, these caves have served as shelter, burial sites, and even hideouts, which means there's a long record of human presence layered over the natural formation. But just as many accounts of people who entered and never came back out. Local folklore doesn't always agree on what's down there. Some stories talk about sounds that travel through stone in ways that don't make sense. Others describe figures glimpsed at the edge of lantern light, distorted by darkness, yet moving with intent. None of that has ever been substantiated in a scientific sense, of course. But what is documented, and far more unsettling, is how easily these environments can disorient even experienced explorers. The absence of natural light, the way sound bends and echoes, the constant humidity, the subtle depletion of oxygen in certain pockets. Down there, your senses don't just fail you, they begin to reinterpret reality. And that's often where the line between what's explainable and what isn't starts to blur. So about 3 years ago, I met a guy through one of these cave exploration groups. Not only did he share this interest, but for him, it was more than just a hobby. It eventually became his work. He studies cave-dwelling organisms, creatures that have adapted over time to survive in environments where darkness is absolute. Essentially, he's a biologist. Back when we first met, though, he hadn't fully gone down that path yet. Over those 3 years, we became pretty close. We talked often, and we even explored a few caves together. At some point, he told me he had bought a cabin in these mountains. In North Carolina, in an area with an incredibly dense concentration of caves. From what he had discovered so far, many of them were interconnected underground. He had been gradually exploring them, documenting what he found, signs that suggested something unusual might be present. Not human, but not entirely unlike humans either. Sometimes it was footprints, other times marks that didn't seem to have been made by animals. Almost like drawings, but hard to make sense of. Occasionally, he'd find animal remains near cave entrances, bones that suggested the animals had been killed and eaten inside the caves, even though they were species that lived outside, which implied something was bringing them in. He also became convinced that whatever was down there had some level of intelligence. He had tried setting up trail cameras at the cave entrances, hoping to capture something. But either the cameras would go missing and later turn up destroyed, or they would record nothing at all. And yet, whenever he went inside, there were clear signs of activity. As he kept exploring, he confirmed that there were multiple entry points, more than anyone had initially thought. But what really unsettled him happened about 9 months ago. He had tried bringing his dog with him to the cabin. He lives with his wife and 2 kids, but spends most of his time alone up there, and he thought the company might help. The dog was used to the outdoors, used to the mountains, to wildlife, so there was no reason to expect a problem. But the moment they got there, something was seriously wrong. The dog became extremely agitated, growling, barking constantly, especially at night. And then, at times, it would start whining in a way that sounded like it was in pain, even though nothing was physically happening to it. He even took the dog to the vet just to make sure everything was fine. But all it took was getting away from that cabin and those caves for the dog to go back to normal. After 2 days, he realized the dog was under too much stress and took it back home. After that, he started feeling uneasy. He couldn't explain it exactly, but he felt like there were more and more signs that whatever was in those caves was becoming aware of him, of his presence, and maybe even growing tired of it. He started to feel unsafe staying in that cabin alone, to the point where he had built multiple escape routes and safety measures into the structure itself. The place was practically designed like a maze, difficult for anyone to navigate from the outside, but carefully planned so he could get out quickly if something ever happened. Eventually, he decided to put together a group, people who could help him explore the caves in numbers. The idea was that we'd all feel safer that way. Honestly, I would have done it for free. This is something I genuinely love, and I wanted to be part of what he was doing. But he had money. Apparently, he had won some kind of award years back that set him up financially, and he insisted on funding the whole thing himself. The pay wasn't huge, but it was enough to bring people in. We ended up forming a solid group, 6 people at first, then 8. We made some basic modifications to the cabin ourselves, nothing fancy, just enough to expand the sleeping areas so all 8 of us could stay there comfortably. Then we got to work. And that's where the real horror begins. Or rather, it had begun a long time ago, probably millions of years back when these caves first formed. But this is the point where it becomes personal. Something I experienced, and something I wish I never had. This isn't an easy story, partly because it's more than just a story. This actually happened. 8 of us went into that cave, but only 6 came back out. And we still don't know what happened to the other 2. This was very recent, still under investigation. There have been posters put up in the area, and a few local news outlets have mentioned the disappearances, but I can't share their names because of the ongoing case. At least, that's what I've been told. It all started one morning. We planned to begin early, not that it really mattered whether we started in the morning, afternoon, or at night. Once you pass a certain point inside those caves, there's no natural light at all, just total darkness. The kind where, if you turn off your flashlight and hold your hand right in front of your face, you still can't see it. There was absolutely nothing unusual about that day. We had already done this before. We had all been inside that cave. We had mapped out at least part of the entrance, and we knew there was a split further in. In fact, there were two branching paths not far from where we were, and we were standing in that exact area when one of us noticed what looked like a small hollow, a kind of recess that seemed to lead deeper into the cave. When we pointed our flashlights toward it, we saw something faintly reflective. It had a subtle sheen to it, something that could have easily been a mineral formation we hadn't documented yet. And since minerals can carry real economic value, we wanted to investigate further. Those two were the first to move forward. They stepped into that section of the cave. Not even 10 seconds later, Michael, who was third in line, was just about to follow them in when everything went wrong. We heard screaming. Then something grabbed him and pulled him downward. We barely had time to react. Instinct kicked in. We grabbed him, pulled him back with everything we had, and without even thinking, all of us started running. As fast as we could, straight back toward the entrance. Thankfully, getting out wasn't difficult. We had set up a rope system, a kind of safety line, to make sure we could navigate back quickly if anything happened. On top of that, we had placed light markers along the path to give us some additional visibility beyond our flashlights. Still, we ran like our lives depended on it. Because they did. Michael was practically being carried between us. And the moment we made it out, we didn't stop. We sprinted straight to the cabin, to the safest area we could think of, and immediately called the police and the park rangers. Michael was taken to the hospital. He had visible injuries on his leg, clear marks showing that something had grabbed him, hard enough to break skin through his pants. But here's the thing, those marks didn't match any known animal. If it had been a large predator, a mountain lion, a bear, something like that, the wounds would have been far worse. Deep punctures, tearing damage. These weren't like that. The impressions were human-like, as if someone had grabbed him with incredible force. The doctors confirmed that the pressure applied to his leg had been significant, far beyond what you'd expect from a normal human grip. And yet, the shape of the marks didn't align with claws. They didn't match any known predator. The area of the cave where this happened has already been investigated, thoroughly. And the only thing we've been told is that there were no traces of the two people who went in first. Nothing. No sign they were ever there. At one point, we ourselves became part of the investigation. There were questions, understandably so. But we're still in the process of being cleared, of proving that we had nothing to do with what happened. And I genuinely don't know what to think anymore. I know none of us were responsible. We were all outside that part of the cave when it happened, trying to pull Michael back. But the fact remains, something exerted a force on him that doesn't make sense. Another thing that was later confirmed to us is that there are no minerals in that part of the cave that reflect light in any meaningful way. So then, what exactly did we see? I've wondered if it could have been eyes reflecting the beam, but the truth is, I wasn't the one who saw the shimmer. So we have no way of knowing if that's even a possibility. But even if it were, wouldn't they have noticed? Wouldn't they have seen movement or something behaving differently from a static surface? I genuinely don't know what to make of it. I've gone over what was said so many times that it feels like my mind is starting to buckle under it. It lines up too closely with what my colleague had been finding. Those signs of intelligence, those indications that something down there might be aware, might be deliberate in how it moves, how it hides. Something that lives in those caves and something that doesn't want to be seen. And I have a feeling that when the investigation is finally made public, we're going to be told that it was just an animal, that they were taken by something known, something explainable. But none of us believe that. This all happened many years ago. In truth, it began long before I was even born, though I had no idea at the time. I only started to understand any of it when I was around 18 or 20. I'll try to tell it from the beginning in a way that makes sense, even though what I'm about to share is essentially the work of my life, something my mother dedicated herself to as well, and there's no way I can fit every detail into a single telling like this. Still, I'll do my best to give you a clear sense of how everything unfolded. To start with, my childhood was shaped by a tense and complicated relationship between my parents. I was born about 47 years ago, and back then, especially in more rural areas near the Smoky Mountains, expectations were different. People valued tradition, and most believed in a very specific idea of what a family should look like. My mother never fit that mold. She wanted to work, to have interests of her own, to exist as more than just someone's wife or someone's mother. She wanted a life that didn't begin and end with my father and me. My father, on the other hand, wanted the opposite. He wanted a woman who stayed home, who cooked, who revolved entirely around him while he was the one out earning money. My mother never accepted that role, and it caused constant friction between them. To be honest, I never liked my father. He was controlling, obsessive, and completely unequipped to handle his own emotions. He couldn't regulate himself, and that had a lasting impact on me growing up. Years later, I found my mother's journals, and through them, I learned what it actually means to be yourself, and to fight for that. But at the time, all I knew was that something in our home always felt wrong. All of that tension led to what happened when I was 14. One day, my mother disappeared. She walked out of the house and never came back. My father told everyone in our town that she had run off, that she didn't care about us, that she chose her own life over her family. That became the official story. To everyone else, she was a woman who abandoned her child and left without looking back. But I never believed it. From the moment she was gone, I felt it in a way I can't fully explain. It didn't feel like she had left. It felt like I had lost her completely, like something had taken her away from me in a final, irreversible way. I spent years trying to get someone to take me seriously, going to the police, insisting something was wrong. I was 14, and they treated me like a joke. They told me my mother was unstable, that I should move on, that I should focus on building a life that didn't look anything like hers. They would tell me very specifically that the purpose of my life should be to control my wife better than my father had. First, to choose the right woman, and then to keep her under control. Those kinds of remarks always made my stomach turn. Those words stayed with me, and not in a good way. Still, I never let go of that feeling that something terrible had happened. When I turned 18, my father suffered a serious health crisis and became bedridden. Suddenly, I was the one taking care of him, managing the house, going through rooms and spaces I had never really been allowed to touch before. It was during that time that I found what he had missed, things that belonged to my mother, items he hadn't managed to destroy. He had burned or thrown away almost everything, but not all of it. Among those remnants, I found a map. There was a marked location deep in the forest, not too far from where we lived, but far enough to feel completely cut off from everything. I don't remember exactly when I started putting the pieces together, whether I was 18 or closer to 20, but I do remember the moment I decided I had to go there. Following that map as precisely as I could, I found it. A cabin, worn down by time, hidden among the trees as if it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The moment I saw it, something shifted in me. I can't explain it properly. It was a feeling that didn't belong to logic, something immediate and certain. A strange, quiet sense of recognition settled over me, and I knew, without any doubt, that this place had belonged to my mother. I also knew my father had no idea it existed. If he had, he would have destroyed it like he destroyed everything else. The cabin was locked, and from that point on, I became fixated on getting inside. I searched for keys, for documents, for anything that would give me access. If I had to, I was prepared to force it open or find a legal way to claim it, because I was certain that whatever was inside belonged to her, and by extension, to me. My father couldn't stop me anymore. He was confined to his bed, and for the first time, I had the freedom to act without his interference. For days, I tore through the house, searching obsessively until I found something I had never noticed before: a narrow slit hidden within a wall. Inside it, there was a key and a letter. I have never read anything that hurt me and healed me at the same time the way that letter did. It was from my mother. She wrote that she loved me more than anything, and that if something ever happened to her, there were only two possibilities. Either I would need to go to the cabin and find the answers myself, or my father had been responsible for whatever had happened. I had already suspected that he might be capable of hurting her. He had become aggressive over the years, unpredictable, quick to lash out. Anger was the only way he knew how to respond to anything, and it often spilled onto the people around him. Reading that letter confirmed what I had felt all along. My mother hadn't simply disappeared. Something had happened to her, and deep down, I understood that she was probably already gone. The key in my hand felt heavy with meaning, and I knew immediately what it was for. That same day, actually, that same night, I left the house. It wasn't the smartest decision. The forest at night is not a place you wander into lightly. especially in the Appalachian region, where there are things people don't fully understand and never really talk about openly. But I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was driven by something stronger than caution, and I made it there without incident. Once inside, I stayed in that cabin for 2 days. I barely ate, surviving on what little I had brought with me. Before leaving, I asked my neighbor to keep an eye on my father, to make sure he had water and the meals I had already prepared for him, all the while feeling this pull, this urge to stay at that cabin. I went through everything, every paper, every object, every trace of my mother's presence. The cabin wasn't just a place to live. It was something else entirely. It was part office, part laboratory. And whatever my mother had been working on, it was far more serious than anything I could have imagined. I always knew my mother was deeply drawn to science. She had a natural curiosity for biology, geology, for the natural world as a whole, even though she was never given a real opportunity to pursue an academic path, let alone study much beyond elementary school. Everything she had built in that cabin, every book, every note, every sample, came from her own effort, her own discipline, her own quiet determination to learn without anyone's help. What I found there changed the way I saw her completely. She had mapped out a network of caves, an entire underground system. Hand-drawn with incredible precision, each tunnel carefully traced, each chamber marked as if she had spent years studying it. The level of detail was astonishing, and it didn't look like guesswork. It looked like documentation. Alongside those maps, she had collected minerals, samples she had clearly taken from inside those caves. And then there were the drawings. Creatures. I still struggle to describe them properly. She had sketched them in detail and written notes beside each one, since she had no way of photographing them. According to her descriptions, they were pale to the point of being almost white, with little to no functional vision. She believed they relied on sound and movement, reacting to vibrations more than anything visual. The noises they made resembled some form of echolocation, like they were communicating or navigating through sound rather than sight. What unsettled me most wasn't just how they looked, but how she described their behavior. She didn't present them as mindless or purely predatory. She wrote about them as if they had structure, awareness, even a kind of restraint. According to her notes, they weren't inherently aggressive beyond basic survival. She believed that if their environment was respected, if humans kept their distance and didn't disturb their habitat, there could be coexistence. She even mentioned leaving small offerings near certain cave entrances and claimed that doing so seemed to reduce signs of disturbance. At the time, I didn't know what to think. Part of me believed she had lost her grip on reality. Another part wondered if she had stumbled onto something far beyond anything I could comprehend. And then there was the simplest explanation. That it was all imagination, an elaborate narrative she had built for herself in isolation. I didn't have the answers, and if I'm being honest, I wasn't eager to go looking for them. For months, I did nothing. The images she had drawn stayed with me. The way she described their size, their strength, the fact that they were taller than us, stronger than us, adapted to an environment we barely understood. It was enough to keep me away. I had responsibilities. I was in my early 20s, trying to build a life, taking care of my father who was already bedridden by then. Whether he deserved it or not didn't matter to me at the time. He was still my father, and I felt obligated to stay. So I kept visiting the cabin, but only to feel closer to her. I never went into the caves. That changed years later. Around my early 30s, something shifted. Maybe it was time, maybe it was frustration, or maybe it was the need to finally confront whatever truth had been left behind. I started going into the caves, slowly at first, never too far, always careful. But I found nothing, no signs of anything unusual, nothing that matched what she had described. And little by little, I convinced myself that it had all been in her head. Until the day I found her. I believe it was her body. Even now, saying that feels unreal. It was one of the most painful moments of my life, but at the same time, it gave me something I had been searching for since I was 14. Certainty. She hadn't abandoned me. She hadn't walked away. She had died out there, around the time she disappeared. And my father had spent years turning her into something she wasn't, while everyone else chose to believe him. What followed happened quickly. The authorities were called, and an investigation began. At first, everything was handled with care. They explained things to me, kept me informed, treated me like I had a right to know. And then, 5 days later, everything changed. The FBI got involved. They took control of everything. The cabin was sealed off, declared part of an ongoing investigation. I was shut out completely. I no longer have access to it, to anything inside, to anything that belonged to my mother, which by every right should now belong to me. I filed paperwork, hired a lawyer, spent money I don't have, not because I want the property back, but because I want answers. I want to be part of the investigation. I want to understand what happened to her. She's been erased. No one tells me anything. No updates, no explanations, nothing. And then I go home, and my father is still there, still bedridden, still shouting the same things over and over again. That she left us, that she didn't care, that she was worthless. No matter how many times I tell him the truth, that she died, that she was more than he ever allowed her to be, he just keeps repeating it like none of this ever happened. My life has become something I don't recognize anymore. All I want is to reclaim what was hers, to understand what she found, to know the truth. But they won't let me anywhere near it. And the more time passes, the more I start to believe that what she described wasn't fiction. That something does exist in those caves, something real, something that they don't want anyone else to find. Because if she was right, if those creatures were capable of coexistence, if they only reacted when disturbed, then why all the secrecy? Why shut me out completely? And the worst part is the thought that this might never end. That I'll spend the rest of my life chasing something I'm not allowed to reach. And that one day I'll die without ever knowing what truly happened to her.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Unfortunately, I don't have the best news to share today. Or maybe it's a mix of good and bad, depending on how you take it. You might have already noticed a slight difference in my voice. For a while now, I've been dealing with some symptoms, especially on days when I record more than once. I feel like I have to push harder to speak, or I need to take long breaks just to get through recordings. Some months it's been better, other times worse, and I've been trying to ignore it for a while. Going to the doctor isn't exactly cheap, and it's easy to keep putting it off. But over the past few weeks, it's become more persistent, and I finally had to get it checked. I was diagnosed with chronic functional dysphonia, which basically means I have to put more effort into speaking. I experience vocal fatigue, inconsistency, and sometimes my voice just gives out. The diagnosis is still very recent, but since then, I haven't really been able to sleep. I've been thinking a lot about the channel, especially now that I just launched the second one. It feels like everything is happening at once. Now here's the part that, for me, is good news. But I understand it might feel different for some of you, especially since many of you are here for the voice as well. I'm lucky to have a very close family, and when I shared this with my brother, he didn't hesitate for a second to step in and help. He's already helped me before when things got overwhelming with the kids and because he genuinely loves what I do here. But now, he's going to be a more regular presence. So for now, I don't know exactly when I'll be able to come back to recording myself. I'm going to be doing some tests, following treatment, and trying to rest my voice as much as possible. In the meantime, my brother will be taking over the narration of the stories. I'll still be the one choosing them, working on them, and building the videos. But it won't be my voice you're hearing for a while. You'll be hearing my brother Chris and sometimes my dad Josh. When one can't do it, the other will step in. They're both a little nervous, especially my brother. But I truly believe they both have great voices, and they'll only get better with time. I'm really sorry, I truly wish I could be here doing this myself. And I hope I'll be back soon. Until then, I just want to say how grateful I am to them both. I honestly couldn't ask for a better family. And to all of you, thank you for being here, and for making it this far with me. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
Everything I'm about to tell happened about 2 years ago. I've gotten a few answers since then, but honestly, not nearly enough to fully understand what really happened. I've told this story a couple of times already, mostly because I think people need to hear about situations like this. The more I've looked into it, the more I've realized things like this aren't as rare as people might think. And the reason I'm bringing it up again now is because not long ago I heard about something with a very similar vibe happening on the Pacific Crest Trail. Not the exact same thing, but close enough that it made my stomach drop when I heard it. Stuff like this can be malicious, it can be seriously dangerous, and in the wrong circumstances, it can absolutely be deadly. Anyway, this all happened a little over 2 years ago. I've always been someone who loves the mountains. I actually live up in the mountains myself, though not in some remote cabin or anything like that. It's a small village with plenty of houses around, so I've got stores, neighbors, everything I need nearby. My house doesn't back directly into the forest either. It's more like living in a small town that just happens to sit right at the edge of wilderness. The thing is, if I walk about 10 minutes in one direction, I'm already stepping into the outer edge of the forest. And that's honestly the perfect balance for me. because I get to live somewhere that feels normal and connected, but at the same time, I can disappear into the woods whenever I want a bit of peace and quiet. When I was younger, I used to explore those woods constantly with my friends. We'd spend entire afternoons out there, climbing rocks, following little streams, getting lost, and then finding our way back again. And I think that's where my love for hiking and climbing really started. Those mountains aren't just where I live, they're one of my favorite places in the world. I've traveled a bit over the years, seen some incredible places, but honestly, there's something about coming back home and seeing those same ridgelines again that just feels right. Nothing truly bad had ever happened to me out there before. Sure, there had been a few tense moments over the years. Anyone who spends time in remote areas knows you have to stay aware of your surroundings. When people come hiking in places like this, they sometimes forget that they're not in a park or a city trail. You're in nature, and that means predators exist. Weather changes fast, and sometimes you run into people whose intentions aren't exactly good. So being prepared goes a long way. Having the right gear, trusting your instincts, knowing when something feels wrong. All that stuff can make the difference between a story you laugh about later and a situation that turns into something much worse. Anyway, the thing that happened to me took place on the third day of a hiking trip. I had decided to explore an area I'd never really been through before. A section closer to West Virginia. In that region, there are a few temporary shelters scattered along the trails. They're nothing fancy, just simple places hikers can use if the weather turns bad, or if they're covering longer distances. My plan that day had been to reach one of those shelters before nightfall. But earlier in the afternoon, I ran into another hiker on the trail. A pretty friendly guy who looked like he'd been having a rough time. His pack had busted a strap, and he was trying to patch it together with duct tape. So I stuck around for a bit and helped him out, which honestly didn't feel like a big deal at the time. But it did slow me down more than I expected. And by the time I got moving again, the sky had already started turning gray. And about half an hour later, the rain came down hard. At first, it was just a light drizzle, but pretty quickly, it turned into steady rain. On top of that, it was getting darker by the minute, and I really wasn't thrilled about the idea of navigating unfamiliar trails in the dark while everything was wet and slippery. So my first thought was simple. I figured I'd just set up my tent somewhere nearby and call it a night. The shelter I'd been aiming for was still a good distance away, and there was no way I was going to reach it before dark anyway. But then something unexpected happened. As I kept moving along the trail, I suddenly came across a structure I hadn't known was there. It was a fire lookout. Now, if you've ever stayed in one of those, you probably know they're actually pretty amazing places. Most of them sit high up on ridges or peaks, so whoever's inside can see huge sections of forest. Some are old and pretty rough, but others are still in decent condition, and hikers are allowed to use them as overnight shelters. I've stayed in a few before, and honestly, they're some of my favorite spots to spend a night out in the mountains. The only thing was, since I'd already run into 2 or 3 other hikers on that same trail, I figured there was a good chance someone might already be using it. That's usually how those places work. Whoever gets there first gets the space. Sometimes people share them, sometimes they don't. And it really depends on the vibe of whoever's already there. Still, I decided to check. The stairs leading up were damp from the rain and a little slippery, so I climbed them slowly. As I got closer, I tried peeking through the windows, and from what I could see inside, the place looked empty. That already felt like a small stroke of luck, so I opened the door and stepped inside. And right away, I felt relieved. The lookout actually seemed pretty well maintained. It looked fairly recent compared to some others I'd seen. And there were even a few supplies left behind by previous hikers. That's honestly pretty rare. A lot of these places get worn down over time because so many people pass through them, and not everyone treats them with much respect. But this one felt different. Someone had clearly taken care of it. Inside it was small but comfortable enough. There were a couple of chairs, a small structure that worked as a bed frame with an actual mattress on it, which again isn't something you always find in those places. Usually it's just a wooden platform. There was also a little built-in stove area where you could heat food, so overall I was pretty happy to have stumbled onto it. The first thing I did was change out of my wet clothes. That was my main priority at that point. I hung the damp stuff over the chairs so it could dry a bit. Then I set up my sleeping bag on the mattress and started getting settled. I'd probably been inside the lookout for about 10 minutes, maybe a little more, when I heard the first noise. It was subtle, something like a wooden board shifting slightly. At first I didn't think much of it. Old structures make noises all the time, especially when there's wind or rain outside. So I paused for a second, looked around the room, and when I didn't see anything unusual, I just went back to what I was doing. After that, I cooked a quick meal, ate, and started winding down for the night. Before going to sleep, I sat on the mattress for a while, reading with my headlamp on. The lookout itself didn't have any electricity, so my headlamp and a small flashlight were the only sources of light in the whole place. Outside the windows, the forest had already turned completely black. That combination created this weird kind of atmosphere inside. Not exactly scary, but very quiet, very isolated, almost like being in a cabin lit only by candlelight. I was feeling pretty comfortable until I heard another sound. And this time, it was closer. I stopped reading immediately and looked up. Again, I slowly scanned the whole room, trying to figure out where it had come from. But I couldn't see anything. Still, something about it made me pause a little longer this time. Because even though I couldn't find the source, I was starting to feel that strange kind of discomfort. The kind that creeps in slowly when something in your gut starts telling you that maybe you're not quite as alone as you thought you were. So for the first time since getting there, I actually stood up from the bed and started looking around properly. And the weird thing was that the whole place suddenly felt different. Not in a way I could clearly explain. Just that strange feeling like something inside the cabin had slightly shifted. Which made no sense at all because the fire lookout was tiny. I mean, genuinely tiny. There was nowhere for another person to hide in there with me. But still, I had heard that noise. There was no denying that. And even though a part of my brain kept trying to tell me it was probably nothing, I wasn't about to be the kind of person who ignores their instincts just to feel better. So I started walking around the inside of the lookout, slowly checking everything. I looked behind the chairs, near the stove, then crouched down and checked under the bed frame too. The structure was pretty solid and lifted a bit off the floor, so I figured maybe some small animal had crawled underneath somehow. But when I looked, there was nothing there, not even a shadow moving. After a few minutes of searching, I had to admit to myself that I couldn't find anything wrong. And that left me in this slightly uncomfortable middle ground, where I couldn't explain the sound, but I also couldn't point to anything actually dangerous. For a moment, I even considered grabbing my gear and leaving anyway. If the weather had been clear, I probably would have done exactly that. Just walked a little farther into the forest and set up my tent somewhere away from the lookout. But when I stepped closer to the window and looked outside, the rain was still coming down, and the forest had turned completely black. Not the kind of dark you get near cities where there's still a glow in the sky. This was the kind where the trees just disappear into pure darkness after a few feet. And even though my headlamp was pretty good, wandering through unfamiliar forest in the middle of the night, in the rain, over wet ground and roots, just wasn't a smart move. So, eventually I told myself I was probably overthinking things, and I went back to the bed. I tried reading again for a while, but honestly, I couldn't focus anymore. My eyes kept moving over the same lines without really processing them, and after a few minutes, I just gave up, turned off the page light, and laid back on the mattress, staring up at the wooden ceiling. At that point, the whole lookout was quiet again, except for the rain tapping against the windows. I'd been lying there maybe 5 minutes, just staring up into the dark, when I noticed something. At first, it was so faint, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. Right above the bed, on the ceiling, there was the faintest little flicker. Not a beam of light, nothing strong like that. Just a tiny little glint that appeared for a split second, and then disappeared. Almost like something reflective catching a bit of light. I kept staring at it. A few seconds passed, and then it flickered again. A tiny point of light, barely visible, blinking once every now and then. The only reason I even noticed it was because I was already lying there staring at the ceiling. If I had just gone straight to sleep, I never would have seen it. The moment my brain actually processed what I was looking at, my entire body went cold. Because suddenly, it was obvious that someone was above me. Somewhere on the roof of that fire lookout, either outside or hidden in some kind of recess in the structure, there was someone positioned directly over that spot, watching me the entire time. My whole body felt like it was buzzing with adrenaline at that point, like every nerve had switched on all at once. But somehow, I forced myself to stay still for a few seconds and think about what I needed to do next. I basically had two choices. I could grab the big pack that had most of my supplies in it, things like food and extra gear, or I could grab my smaller backpack, which only had a couple of protein bars in it, but also had my handgun and my satellite phone. The decision took maybe half a second, and the moment my brain made it, my body just moved. I jumped up from the bed, rushed to the smaller backpack, grabbed it, swung the door open, and bolted down the stairs as fast as I could. The second my boots hit the ground outside, I heard movement above me. Whoever had been up there had clearly not expected me to run like that, because a moment later, I heard them scrambling down as well. At that point, I didn't really have time to process anything. The only thought running through my head was that someone had been inside that structure with me the entire time, waiting for me to fall asleep so they could do whatever they had planned to do. And I had no intention of sticking around to find out. So I ran. I ran as fast as I could into the forest, rain hitting the leaves all around me, branches slapping against my jacket as I pushed through them. But there was a problem. The flashlight I had in this smaller bag wasn't nearly as strong as the one I'd left inside the lookout. The main one had a powerful beam that could cut through the trees pretty well, but this one was weaker. I could see the ground just enough to keep moving, but anything more than a few feet ahead was just darkness. So I was basically sprinting half blind through wet forest, trying not to trip while also fumbling with the bag to pull the flashlight out properly. At the same time, I kept shouting back over my shoulder that I was armed and that I wouldn't hesitate to fire if I had to. The truth, though, was that I had no idea if the person chasing me was armed too, and I could hear them behind me. Not right on top of me, but definitely running in the same direction, crashing through branches and leaves as they followed. And then the inevitable happened. Between the rain, the slippery ground, and the roots sticking out everywhere, my foot caught on something and I went down hard. I hit the ground and my head slammed against the dirt, and for a moment, everything went a little fuzzy. That's when real panic hit me, because I was suddenly on the ground, dizzy, vulnerable, and I knew the person behind me was still coming. So the only thing I could do was reach into the bag, grab the handgun as fast as I could, and bring it up in front of me. I pointed it toward where I knew he was coming from. At that point, he was maybe 16 feet away from me, but I still couldn't see him clearly in the darkness. I just knew he was there. Then I saw movement. And a second later, he stepped into the faint edge of my flashlight beam. He was dressed completely in black, and he had some kind of hood over his head. Not the hood of a jacket either. More like one of those fabric hoods that cover most of your face, leaving only small openings. I aimed the gun directly at him and told him that if he took one more step, I would fire. Now, a lot of people like to think they know how they'd react in a moment like that. They imagine themselves pulling the trigger without hesitation. But the reality of holding a gun in your hand and actually being seconds away from using it on another human being is something completely different. Your body is flooded with adrenaline, your mind is racing, part of you wants to act immediately, while another part is trying to process what's even happening. Maybe I should have shot him in the leg. Maybe I should have tried to disable him and call the police right there. But in that moment, I just couldn't do it. So we stood there for a few seconds. Me on the ground, soaked and shaking, the gun pointed straight at him. Him standing about 16 feet away in the dark. Then, without saying a single word, he slowly turned around and disappeared back into the trees. I stayed there on the ground for a while after that, completely drenched from the rain, my whole body shaking from the adrenaline rush. Not even really from fear anymore, just the aftermath of everything that had just happened hitting me all at once. Eventually, I managed to grab my satellite phone and call the park rangers. I explained where I was and told them exactly what had happened. Then I just waited. It took them about 3 hours to reach me. By the time they finally got there, the sky was already starting to lighten a little, since I'd gone to sleep pretty late that night to begin with. During that entire time, I just sat there on the forest floor with the gun in my hands, pointing out into the darkness, half expecting that guy to come back at any moment. But he never did. The rangers eventually took me out of there and brought me to a hospital, mostly because I'd hit my head pretty hard during the fall, and they wanted to make sure I didn't have a concussion. Luckily, it turned out to be nothing serious, just a bad impact. But once they started investigating the lookout itself, they found something that explained at least part of what had happened. Someone had modified the structure. Specifically, they had created a small hidden opening in the ceiling, right above the bed. The simple idea of someone being that sick leaves me completely creeped out. So, after everything that happened, there was obviously an investigation. The park rangers went back to the fire lookout with law enforcement, and from what they later told me, they were able to confirm that the structure had actually been tampered with. That small opening in the ceiling above the bed wasn't part of the original design. Someone had deliberately modified it, so there was a narrow space above the roof beams where a person could hide, or at least lie flat and look down through that gap. This means that whoever had been up there wasn't just passing through or hiding from the rain. They had built that space on purpose. And the position of the hole right above the bed made it pretty clear what the idea behind it was. Someone could stay hidden up there, wait for someone to come in, wait for them to fall asleep, and then do whatever they planned to do once that person was completely vulnerable. A few days after the incident, they told me they had actually detained a man somewhere in the forest. Apparently, he had some strange things in his possession, stuff that could be used to restrain someone. They didn't go into a lot of detail with me, but the way they explained it was that he was considered a person of interest, and that the circumstances in which he was found were suspicious enough that they wanted to question him. At one point, they even asked me to come in and try to identify him. But the moment I saw the guy, I knew it wasn't him. I'm absolutely certain about that. The man who chased me that night was taller, noticeably taller, and much more heavily built. The guy they brought in looked smaller, thinner, and honestly just didn't match what I had seen in those few seconds when the flashlight beam hit him in the forest. So, I told them exactly that. I said I couldn't confirm it was the same person. Now maybe that other guy was doing something strange out there too. Maybe he had nothing to do with my situation. Or maybe there was some kind of connection that was never fully explained. I honestly have no idea. The police never followed up with me about it in detail, and eventually the whole thing just sort of faded out from their side. But one thing I know for sure is that the man who was inside that fire lookout with me, the one who chased me into the forest, was never found. And that's the part that still bothers me sometimes, because I don't know how long he had been hiding in that space above the ceiling. I don't know if he had just gotten there that day, or if he had been waiting there for hours, or even longer, hoping someone would eventually show up. What I do know is that he was clearly waiting for someone to walk into that lookout, get comfortable, fall asleep, and become an easy target. And that realization is honestly terrifying. Since then, I've actually heard about 2 other cases that were somewhat similar. Not in fire lookouts specifically, but in those temporary shelters you sometimes find along hiking trails. Apparently, there have been situations where people modified those structures too, either creating hidden openings, false panels, or ways to trap someone inside. I don't know how common it really is, and I don't want to sound like I'm trying to scare people away from hiking, because most of the time, these places are completely safe. But after what happened to me, I can tell you one thing for sure. I will never again walk into one of those shelters or lookout towers and just assume everything is normal. Now, whenever I enter a place like that, especially if I'm alone and far from other people, I check everything. The walls, the ceiling, the corners, behind the bed frames, any panels that look slightly out of place. I make sure there aren't any hidden spaces, false walls, anything that could allow someone to watch from above or hide nearby. It might sound a little paranoid, but after that night, I'd rather take a few extra minutes checking every inch of the place than ever go through something like that again. Growing up, I was always a chubby kid. I don't mean just a little overweight. I mean the kind of kid who carries that weight, not just on their body, but in everything they do, in how they walk, how they talk, how they look at themselves. A lot of that came from my home life, which wasn't great, and food kind of became my way of dealing with things, my escape. The one thing that felt consistent when everything else didn't. But then on top of that, school wasn't any better, because kids notice those things, and they don't let them go. So I ended up getting bullied a lot for my weight. And those two things combined just completely destroyed my self-esteem in a way that stuck with me for years. Even later on, when I hit my teenage years and started working out, eating better, and eventually got into really good shape, none of that actually fixed what was going on in my head, because every time I looked in the mirror, I still saw that same kid, the one people used to laugh at, the one nobody wanted to be around. It didn't matter how much I changed physically, that image never really went away. So by the time I got to college, even though I looked completely different, I still carried myself the same way. Quiet, unsure, kind of submissive, never really knowing how to fit in or who to talk to. And people, especially other guys who were insecure in their own way, but better at hiding it, could pick up on that immediately and would still mess with me, just in more subtle ways. I'm saying all of this just to give you some context, because when one of the most popular guys in my class invited me to go on a hike with him in the mountains, I didn't even hesitate. I said yes immediately, because I was starving for real connection, for real friendship. And in my head, I thought that if someone like him accepted me, everything would change. People would start seeing me differently, like I belonged, like I was one of them. But more than that, I think I just wanted to finally be able to look at myself and see someone worth being around. So, when he suggested we drive out to a trail in West Virginia, I went along with it without questioning much, even though it was about a 2-hour drive from where we lived, and even though the forest he picked was one I had heard about my whole life from my grandparents, who used to tell these weird, unsettling stories about things that happened out there. I'll be honest, I was a little nervous about going, but I didn't want to show that, not to him, not when I finally had a chance to be included in something. What I did find a little strange, though, was that he wanted it to be just the two of us. And when I asked about it, he told me his friends didn't want to come because they were scared of the stories about the place, and that he figured I wouldn't be like that I'd be cool enough to go anyway. And I'm not gonna lie, that got to me. It boosted my ego in a way I wasn't used to. And during the drive, I actually felt good, like maybe this was the start of something different for me. The plan was to camp for 2 nights and do some hiking around the area. But pretty early on, I started noticing something that didn't sit right with me. Because while I had brought a tent, proper gear, extra food, basically everything you'd expect for a couple of nights out there, he barely had anything with him. At first I thought maybe I had just over-prepared which is something I tend to do. But looking back now, I'm pretty sure he never planned on staying out there that long in the first place. We started hiking, and about 20 minutes in, we were still on the more popular part of the trail, so there were a few people around. Nothing unusual, just other hikers enjoying the weather. But then there was this moment where we stopped for a bit, and I swear I saw him making some kind of gesture toward a guy who was walking past us. It wasn't obvious, but it wasn't nothing either, and it immediately caught my attention. I asked him if he knew the guy, and he just kind of brushed it off, saying no, that the guy had made some weird motion and he was just trying to figure out what it meant. But the way he said it felt off, like something made up on the spot, and I couldn't shake that feeling. It was small, but it stuck with me. And for some reason, it made me uneasy enough that I told him I was going to grab some water. And while I was reaching into my bag, I also took the knife I had brought. Just a kitchen knife, nothing special, but sharp, and moved it into the small pouch I kept on me so I could reach it quickly if I needed to. I didn't even fully understand why I did that at the time. It just felt like one of those instinctive decisions you make without thinking too much about it. And looking back, I'm really glad I listened to that feeling. Later that day, after we had been walking for a while and hadn't seen anyone else on the trail for at least an hour, we stopped again, and he told me he was going to step off the trail for a second, said he needed to take a leak, and walked off into the trees. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a minute or two, I started to notice how quiet everything had gotten. And that's when I saw him, a man standing in the distance, partially hidden between the trees, just watching us. The moment I looked directly at him, he started walking toward me. I called out to Jake, trying to keep my voice steady, telling him there was someone out there and that he was coming our way, but there was no response. That's when something in me really started to shift, because it didn't make sense. Why had he gone so far off the trail? Why wasn't he answering? Where was he? I moved toward the direction Jake had gone, calling his name again, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just that growing feeling that something was very, very wrong. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man getting closer, picking up his pace slightly, not running, but not exactly walking normally either, and that was enough for me to panic. So I turned and started heading back toward the trail as fast as I could, calling for Jake one last time, but deep down, I already knew he wasn't coming back. I couldn't see him anywhere, and the longer I stood there, the worse it felt. So eventually, I just started running. And that's when I saw the second man. He stepped out from the side, and I recognized him instantly as the same guy from earlier, the one I had seen Jake making gestures to, near the start of the trail. And in that moment, everything just clicked into place in the worst possible way. Jake hadn't invited me out there to hang out. He had set me up. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of fear mixed with betrayal at the same time, because the one person I had trusted, the one person I thought might actually see me differently, had just handed me over to something I didn't even understand yet. I didn't think, I just ran, and the only thing that saved me in that moment was the fact that all those years of working out, of pushing myself, of refusing to go back to who I used to be, actually meant something, because I was fast enough to put some distance between us, at least for a while. But I could hear them behind me, crashing through the trees, closing the gap slowly, and no matter how fast I ran, it didn't feel like it was enough. At one point, one of them must have known the terrain better than I did, because he cut across through the trees and suddenly appeared right in front of me, intercepting my path before I even had time to react. I barely had a second to process what was happening before he lunged at me, and all I could do was pull out the knife and swing it without really aiming, just trying to get him off me. I felt the blade connect with something, and he let out this horrible raw sound, immediately pulling back, clutching his arm, and I saw that I had torn into his bicep, not clean, not precise, just enough to make him let go. Then I didn't stop again. I couldn't. I just kept running, gripping the knife, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode, until eventually I saw someone ahead on the trail. Another hiker. At first, when he saw me coming out of the trees, covered in dirt, holding a bloodied knife, he panicked and started backing away. But I started yelling, trying to explain between breaths that there were people behind me, that I needed help, that I wasn't the threat. And I think something in my voice made him stop. He actually decided to help me. Something in my voice made it clear that I wasn't exaggerating, that I wasn't just some guy being dramatic. I was genuinely panicking, and I needed help right then and there. And he picked up on that immediately. He told me pretty quickly that he knew that trail really well, that he'd hiked that area multiple times before, and that not too far from where we were, there was a small shelter, kind of tucked away, where we could hide out and get through the night safely. And he also mentioned that he had some form of protection on him, so I shouldn't worry, that he wasn't just gonna leave me hanging if those guys showed up. That did calm me down a bit, I'm not gonna lie, but at the same time, there was still this part of my brain that just wouldn't shut off, this constant voice telling me that I'd already trusted the wrong person once that day. So, what was stopping me from making that same mistake again? For a while, I genuinely wondered if he could be involved too, if maybe this whole thing was bigger than I thought, like maybe they were all in on it somehow. So, even as we made our way to that shelter and settled in for the night, I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder, listening to every little sound in the woods, every branch snapping, every shift in the wind, thinking that at any moment those guys would come out of the darkness and that this man next to me would suddenly switch on me as well. The night felt incredibly long, like time had just stretched out in the worst possible way, and my mind kept running through scenario after scenario, none of them good, all of them ending with me not making it out of there. But the truth is, nothing actually happened. He stayed calm the whole time, kept reassuring me in a way that didn't feel forced, didn't feel fake, just steady, like someone who had been in tough situations before and knew how to keep it together. At one point, I remember asking him why he even bothered helping me, because most people wouldn't get involved in something like that. And he just kind of shrugged and said he had a younger brother, probably around my age, and if something like that ever happened to him, he'd hope someone would step in and help. There was something about the way he said it that felt real, not like an excuse, not like something rehearsed, just honest. And I think that's when I finally started to relax a little, not completely, but enough that those last couple hours before sunrise didn't feel as suffocating as the rest of the night. Once morning came, we packed up and started moving again, sticking to the trail and keeping a steady pace. And after a while, we finally reached the trailhead, where there were other people around, which immediately made me feel safer, like I was back in the real world again. We were able to contact the authorities pretty quickly, and they showed up not long after. And then Jake showed up. He came walking into the trailhead like nothing had happened, arguing with me, saying I had abandoned him out there, that he'd been looking for me. He had a few cuts on his arm, but nothing deep, nothing that looked like he'd actually been attacked. And the more I looked at him, the more everything started to click in my head all at once. The lack of gear from the beginning, the way he disappeared at the exact moment those guys showed up, the fact that he didn't respond when I was literally shouting his name, and then the idea that somehow they went after me but just let him go. It didn't make any sense, unless he was part of it. I told the police everything, every little detail, including the fact that I was almost certain he was involved, that those men didn't just randomly appear, that there had to be some kind of setup. And to their credit, they did take it seriously. They said he would be looked into. They said that his story didn't fully add up either. But at the same time, there wasn't enough solid proof to actually do anything about it, so nothing really came of it in the end, and that was probably one of the hardest parts. Just knowing that he got to walk away from it. For the rest of college, I lived with that in the back of my mind, constantly, always watching where I was going. Never walking alone at night, avoiding isolated areas on campus, because I genuinely didn't know if he'd try something again, or if those people were still out there somewhere. It changed the way I saw people, the way I trusted people, and honestly, it took me a long time to get past that. Eventually, I graduated, I moved out of state, got away from all of that, and little by little I stopped looking over my shoulder every 5 seconds. But those 3 years, they left a mark. I did stay in touch with the guy who helped me though, because the truth is, if it wasn't for him, I don't know how that situation would have ended. And funny enough, he really did have a younger brother around my age, and over time, we actually became close. So, in a weird way, something good did come out of all of this, and now I kind of see both of them as family. I wanted to share this because sometimes the people you trust the fastest are the ones you should be the most careful with. And I know what it's like to feel invisible, to want acceptance so badly that you ignore your instincts. But if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that your gut feeling is there for a reason. Listen to it.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Before we get into today's video, I just wanted to say thank you for the incredible support you showed on the new channel. You guys are amazing. I also noticed that some people had trouble finding it, so from now on, I'll always leave the link at the very top of the video description, and possibly in the comments as well. Now, talking about today's video, we're diving into 2 longer stories that I've actually been wanting to share on the channel for quite some time. Both are genuinely unsettling, but I have to say the first one really got to me. It gave me real chills the first time I read it, and even again while I was editing the video. I hope you feel the same way I did, and as always, let me know what you think in the comments. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Me and my wife have always been pretty adventurous people. We love hiking, climbing, spending time in the mountains, and over the years we've invested in quite a bit of gear to keep ourselves safe whenever we go camping. Anyone who has camped in remote places knows that when you're sleeping in a tent, you're basically protected by nothing more than a thin layer of fabric. And whatever is out there, whether it's animals or people, is only a few feet away. And honestly, believe me when I say that people are usually a lot scarier than animals. Over the years, the two of us have had a few encounters that were, let's just say, a little messed up. Strange hikers, people behaving oddly out in the woods, things that made us pack up and leave a place earlier than we planned. But even with all of that, nothing we had experienced before was anything like what happened during the trip I'm about to tell you about. Even now, it still disturbs me, mostly because of how surreal and different it was from anything I had ever heard about before. And it was probably because the person who tormented us was pretty messed up. A total lunatic. And it's honestly scary to think someone can go that far. A while back, we decided to spend a week in a part of the Appalachian Mountains on the Pennsylvania side, an area where we had already camped a few times in the past. It's not a very well-known location, and for that reason I'm not going to mention the exact place, because I don't want it to suddenly turn into some kind of weird tourist attraction because of what happened. That sort of thing happens sometimes, and I'd rather avoid it, especially since there's a very small village not too far from there. And if that place suddenly filled up with curious people, it would probably lose all of its charm. So the area was fairly isolated, although not completely cut off from civilization. If you walked for about an hour along one of the trails, you could reach that little village. But other than that, there really wasn't much going on around there. Instead of camping this time, we decided to rent a cabin. It was actually the same cabin we had stayed in the year before. We had liked it a lot. The owner had been very friendly, and when we contacted him again, he even gave us a small discount since we were coming back for a second stay. Everything felt perfect. It was a place we already knew, and we sometimes joked that it was almost like our little home during that time of the year, because the previous year we had visited during the exact same week. It was early March, which is honestly a beautiful time to be in the mountains. The air is still a little cold, and the ground is still damp from winter, but you can already see the forest starting to turn green again as spring slowly pushes through. If you don't mind a bit of rain during your hikes, it's actually a great time to travel because prices are cheaper and the trails are much quieter. So we arrived at the cabin excited and in a great mood. The place had 2 floors. The downstairs was mostly open, with a small living room area, a kitchen, and then at the back there was a little storage room with a door where the owner kept cleaning supplies, an extra sleeping bag, and a few random things. Upstairs there was a fairly large bathroom, a comfortable bedroom, and then a very small second room next to it. That room had a small bed, so it could work as a kid's bedroom. But since we don't have children, we usually just used it to store our gear and backpacks. When we got there, we unloaded everything, settled in, and started organizing the place. We always bring some protective gear when we go on trips like this, although we didn't bring all the equipment we normally use when we're camping, like motion sensors and a small perimeter alarm that alerts us if someone approaches the campsite. Those are things we usually rely on when we're sleeping in a tent in the middle of nowhere, because personal safety is extremely important when you're in remote areas, and we've learned not to assume that bad things only happen to other people. But in a cabin, you naturally feel a little more comfortable, a little more protected. Everything was going smoothly, just like it had the year before. On the first day, we unpacked all the food and organized it in the kitchen, dividing everything by meals for the 7 days we were planning to stay there. We're big fans of meal prep, especially on trips like this, because it means we don't have to worry about cooking complicated meals and can focus on enjoying the hikes instead. So, on that first afternoon, we prepared everything for the whole week, stacked the firewood neatly inside the cabin, and basically got the place ready for the days ahead. Even though daytime temperatures were comfortable enough, nights in the mountains are always colder, and there's something really nice about sitting in a warm room with the fireplace going after a long hike. That night we went to bed early, and the next morning we woke up feeling completely refreshed and ready for our first hike. But it was during that very first climb that I started feeling a slight sense of discomfort. Now, I'm not the kind of person who jumps to conclusions or thinks everything is some kind of conspiracy. I'm confident in my ability to handle myself in the mountains. I know what I'm doing out there, and I don't usually let my imagination run wild. In fact, I'm normally the type of person who rolls his eyes when someone says they feel like they're being watched. But that day, that was exactly the feeling I had. It was subtle at first, just this strange impression that we weren't completely alone. Like there was someone else somewhere in the forest around us, just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe another hiker somewhere on a nearby trail. Then at one point my wife looked at me and said she felt the same thing. She said she had the weird sensation that someone was watching us, and that the whole area suddenly felt bad. We finished the hike anyway, but the entire way back to the cabin, we both had that same uneasy feeling, like something wasn't quite right. The strange part was that we hadn't seen anyone the entire day. Not a single hiker, not even distant voices on the trails. And yet we both had this strong impression that we hadn't been alone out there. Eventually we got back to the cabin, made dinner, and lit the fireplace. After spending the whole day hiking, we were both pretty tired, and the warmth of the room made it even easier to relax. We put on a movie, sat on the couch together, and at some point we both ended up falling asleep without even realizing it. But later that night, I suddenly woke up. The movie was still playing quietly on the television, and the room was lit by that soft, flickering light from the screen and the dying fire in the fireplace. I checked the clock, and it was around 1 a.m. I woke up with the feeling that I had heard a loud laugh. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you honestly, that's what it sounded like. A frantic laugh. I looked over at my wife, because that was the most logical explanation. But she was still asleep on the couch beside me, with the blanket half pulled over her shoulders, breathing slowly, and not reacting to anything. So whatever I had heard hadn't come from her. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to figure out if maybe it had come from the TV instead, because the movie was still playing quietly in the background. But when I paid attention to it for a few seconds, I realized the scene on screen was completely quiet. Just two characters walking through some hallway, and there hadn't been any laughter in it. Normally, I'm the kind of person who immediately tries to find the rational explanation for things like that, especially when you're half asleep, because your brain does weird things when you wake up suddenly. So at first I honestly assumed I must have dreamed it, or maybe heard something outside, and my brain just filled in the rest. Looking back now, that moment right there was probably the first in a long chain of decisions that I honestly shouldn't have made. It's strange to admit it, because I like to think of myself as someone fairly cautious when it comes to being in remote places. But that night I did a few things that were just stupid. Completely unnecessary risks. And the worst part is that I didn't just put myself in danger. I also put my wife in that situation. At first, I simply got up from the couch to walk into the kitchen and grab a glass of water. Mostly to wake myself up properly and shake off that weird feeling of having just heard something that didn't make sense. But that's when I heard another sound. It was faint at first, and I couldn't really place it. It had this metallic quality to it, like metal slowly scraping or rubbing against metal. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. And the more I listened, the more it seemed like it was coming from somewhere outside the front. So, I walked toward the living room window as quietly as I could. The cabin had those wooden shutters on the inside, and I slowly pushed one of them open just enough to look through the glass and see if I could spot anything outside. But there was nothing. Just darkness, trees, and the faint outline of the forest beyond the small clearing around the cabin. The sound continued though, slow and rhythmic. Curious, I unlocked the window and pushed it open slightly, just enough that the sound became clearer. And that's when it clicked. It sounded exactly like a swing. Not the clean sound of a new one, but the creaking metal of an old playground swing. The kind you'd hear in a schoolyard where the chains have started rusting and every movement produces that long, tired squeal of metal grinding against metal. It was such a bizarre thing to hear out there that for a few seconds I just stood there, trying to process it. A swing in the middle of the woods, at 1 in the morning. And that's when I made the decision I mentioned earlier, the irrational one. Instead of closing the window and forgetting about it, instead of waking my wife or just locking the doors and staying inside like any normal person would probably do, I grabbed the keys from the small table near the door and quietly stepped outside. My wife was still asleep on the couch, and she's always been a very heavy sleeper, so I didn't expect the door opening to wake her. I told myself I was just going to take a quick look. That was it. The cold night air hit me the moment I stepped outside, and the sound of the swing immediately became clearer. It was definitely coming from somewhere just beyond the trees in front of the cabin. So I started walking toward it. Slowly at first, trying not to make too much noise on the gravel and damp ground around the clearing. And that's when I started hearing something else mixed in with the creaking. Every now and then, between the slow movements of the swing, there was a quiet little laugh. Not the loud, frantic laugh I had heard earlier. This one was softer, almost like someone quietly chuckling to themselves. It was unmistakably an adult voice, but there was something about the way it sounded that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a normal laugh. It sounded strange somehow, like someone enjoying something in a very private, unsettling way. That was the moment I really started feeling scared, because suddenly none of it made sense anymore. We were deep in the forest, miles away from anything resembling a playground or a park. And yet there I was, standing in the dark, listening to a rusty swing creaking back and forth, while someone out there laughed softly to themselves. It was completely out of place, completely surreal. And then I saw him. Even now, when I think back on that moment, it still feels like something out of a nightmare. Hanging from one of the larger branches of a tree about 20 yards away was a swing that had clearly been put together by hand. Just a wooden plank tied with chains over the branch. And sitting on it, slowly rocking back and forth in the moonlight, was a grown man dressed as a clown. He was just swinging there, pushing lightly with his feet every few seconds, his head tilted slightly forward as if he was watching the ground while quietly laughing to himself. It looked less like a real situation and more like something out of a horror movie. Or maybe something you'd see in a psychiatric hospital if someone had escaped and wandered into the woods. For a second, I honestly couldn't even process what I was looking at. My brain just refused to accept that what I was seeing was real. I had already started turning around to head back toward the cabin when the swing suddenly stopped moving. The man lifted his head slowly and looked directly at me. Even from that distance, I could see the white makeup on his face and the exaggerated smile painted across it. Then he said one word, just a casual little greeting. But the way he said it sent a chill straight through me. Every instinct in my body suddenly kicked in at once, and I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard the chains of the swing rattle as he jumped off it, and a second later, I could hear him running too. That was the moment pure panic set in. I started shouting for my wife as loud as I possibly could while sprinting back toward the cabin, yelling for her to open the door even though part of me was convinced she wouldn't hear me. Like I said, she sleeps deeply, and normally something like that wouldn't wake her. But I must have been screaming at the top of my lungs, because just as I reached the porch, the front door suddenly flew open. My wife was standing there, completely confused and terrified, asking what the hell was going on. I barely managed to get inside before slamming the door shut behind me. Almost immediately, there was a heavy impact against the other side of it. It sounded like someone had just thrown their entire body against the door. My wife was now yelling too, asking what was happening, and I was trying to explain between breaths that there was a clown outside, which even as I said it out loud, sounded completely insane. Then we heard a tapping sound at the window, and we both turned toward it at the same time. He was standing right there, his hand pressed flat against the glass, tapping slowly, while he stared at us through the window I had opened earlier. And he was smiling, just standing there in the darkness outside the cabin, smiling straight at us. Luckily, I had closed the window before stepping outside earlier. Otherwise, he would have had direct access to the room. I didn't waste time thinking after that. I grabbed the handgun we had brought with us and aimed it toward the window, shouting that I had no problem using it if he didn't leave us alone. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He just stood there staring. That was when my wife completely snapped. Before I even realized what she was doing, she grabbed the gun from my hands, aimed it slightly away from the window, and fired a shot into the wooden wall near it. The sound of the gunshot inside the cabin was deafening. She shouted that if he didn't leave immediately, the next one would be aimed directly at him. For the first time since we had seen him, the clown actually reacted. He slowly turned his head toward her, and the smile on his face somehow got worse. It's hard to describe it, but there was something about the look he gave her that felt completely psychopathic. Not anger, not fear. Just this cold, amused expression that made my stomach drop. Then he turned around and walked back into the forest. Just like that. We immediately closed the shutters over the window and locked everything in the cabin. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, as soon as there was enough daylight to see properly, we ran straight to the car and drove out of there as fast as we could. Of course, we reported everything. The police eventually found the swing hanging from that tree, exactly where we had described it. It had clearly been built by someone and left there intentionally. Because of the gunshot, we ended up having to pay for the damage to the cabin wall. Although the owner was surprisingly understanding and actually covered part of the repair costs himself once he heard what had happened. I think he felt genuinely bad that something like that had happened on his property. He wasn't the one who built the swing. In fact, even though it was fairly close to the cabin, it wasn't close enough that it would make sense for something like that to be there for a kid to use while their parents watched from the house. And the truth is, he had no idea that swing was even there. As far as we know, there haven't been any other incidents reported there since. But no one ever figured out who that clown was, why he was out there in the middle of the night, or whether he even knew we were staying in that cabin before he saw me step outside. Maybe he just wanted to scare someone. Maybe he was completely insane. All I know is that the way he slammed into that door showed he could run incredibly fast. And the way he looked at my wife when she threatened him is something I'll probably never forget. We haven't gone back to the forest since. Not after a night like that. I think some experiences just stay with you forever. What I'm about to tell you happened fairly recently, but if I start where it actually happened, none of it will make sense. To understand why I reacted the way I did, why I didn't just brush things off, You need to know where I come from, and who we were before life pulled us in different directions. I grew up in a small town tucked deep into the Great Smoky Mountains, part of the wider Appalachian Range. 37 years ago, that place felt even smaller than it probably was. News didn't travel fast. Trends didn't reach us until years later, if they reached us at all. Everyone knew everyone. Not in the polite, wave from the porch way. Really knew them. Their parents, their grandparents, their business. There were 6 of us who were inseparable. 6 kids who grew up more like siblings than friends. We spent our days running through the woods, building half-collapsed forts, daring each other to knock on doors and sprint away before someone answered. We worked too. That was just part of it. Helping with repairs, hauling wood, picking up odd jobs whenever someone needed an extra pair of hands. Times weren't easy, but we didn't feel deprived. We had freedom. The kind you don't really see anymore. We disappeared into the mountains at sunrise and came back when the sky turned orange, and nobody panicked. Eventually, though, life did what it always does. Some of us left for college. Some went straight into work. We all followed different paths, and without any big fight or dramatic fallout, we drifted. For 7 years, the 6 of us were never in the same place at the same time. We'd message occasionally. One of us would be in town and meet up with another for coffee. But the group, the original 6, never reunited. Until last year. One of the pillars of our community passed away. An older man who had been there for all of us in different ways. He'd helped our families when money was tight. He showed up to school events, fixed broken fences, gave advice whether you asked for it or not. His funeral brought the whole town together, and it brought us back. We all planned to stay about a week. At first, it was just about paying our respects. Then it became coffee meetups, late-night conversations, catching up on who we'd become. 7 years is a long time. We weren't kids anymore. We had jobs, responsibilities, and more baggage. It was during one of those afternoons that Michael suggested we do something we used to do all the time. Camp in the Smokies. I'll call him Michael, even though that's not his real name. Michael had always made me slightly uncomfortable. Even as a kid, there was something about him that felt off. He could be charming when he wanted to be, funny and magnetic even. But there were moments, small, sharp ones, where he'd say something unnecessarily cruel. Or he'd disappear for hours and come back with a look on his face like he knew something the rest of us didn't. As kids, I ignored it. We all did. When you grow up together, you don't want to believe one of your own might not be who you think they are. Still, when he suggested a trip, no one objected. Back then, we used to camp with barely any gear. Cheap tents, thin sleeping bags, sometimes not enough food. Now, we were adults. We had steady incomes. So instead of roughing it, we decided to rent a cabin. Michael offered to handle the booking. That probably should have been my first hesitation. But the cabin he found was surprisingly cheap, almost suspiciously so. I remember thinking we'd show up to something falling apart. No running water, no heat. But when we arrived, it was the opposite. It was beautiful and cozy. Recently renovated by the look of it. The wood smelled fresh. The furniture wasn't worn down. It didn't feel abandoned or neglected. It felt lived in. Either it was rented often, or someone used it regularly. The first day went perfectly. We unpacked, laughed about old stories, grilled food outside while the sun dipped behind the trees. And for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. Like we were just older versions of the same 6 kids. But that night, sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up. I've always had a light sleep. Insomnia has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. So when I heard footsteps on the stairs, it pulled me right out of whatever shallow sleep I'd managed to get. Slow, careful steps. Someone heading downstairs. I didn't think much of it. One of the guys probably needed water, or couldn't sleep. So I turned over and tried to ignore it. Then I heard what sounded like the front door. Not just the handle, but the door itself. Like a faint shift of air, and the soft thud of it closing. I remember lying there, half awake, debating whether I'd imagined it. I didn't want to be up all night, stuck in that restless spiral I know too well. So I forced myself to relax, and eventually, I drifted off. The next day, during a hike, I casually mentioned it. Said I thought I'd heard someone go downstairs, maybe even step outside. They all looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Every single one of them said they'd slept straight through the night. No one got up. No one went downstairs. No one opened the door. And I knew, absolutely knew, I hadn't dreamed the footsteps. The sound of someone opening the door I could maybe question. But the footsteps, that had been real. Still, I let it go. What was the alternative? That someone was lying for no reason? It didn't make sense. So I dropped it. But that night, it happened again. This time it was closer to 3 in the morning. The same slow steps, the same careful descent. Only now, I was fully awake. Instead of staying in bed, I got up quietly. I cracked my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, careful not to make the floorboards creak. From where I stood, I could see down toward the staircase that led to the main floor. I watched Michael walk down, with no hesitation and no confusion, like he knew exactly where he was going. I stayed hidden and moved closer to a window that overlooked the front of the cabin. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want him to see me watching. He opened the front door and stepped outside. For a second, I wondered if maybe he had insomnia too. Maybe he just needed air, needed space. So I tried to rationalize it. That's what we do when something feels wrong. We search for the most normal explanation. From the shadow of the window, I watched him circle the cabin slowly. Then he kept walking past the edge of the yard, straight into the trees. I'll admit it. Watching him disappear into the trees like that made me genuinely uncomfortable. Not just because of the folklore that hangs over the Smokies, the old stories about people wandering off at night and coming back different, but because he had done the exact same thing the night before, and then flat out denied it. My mind was already running at full speed. There was no way I was going back to sleep. So I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for him to return. But he didn't come back until 5:30 in the morning. And that's over 2 hours. 2 full hours out there in the woods in the middle of the night. When I heard the door open again, I didn't think. I just moved. I got up, rubbed my eyes, and walked out of my room as if I'd just woken up. I caught him stepping inside. I asked if he'd been up long. He said no. Said he'd just woken up too. That he'd stepped outside for some air. I just smiled and nodded. Pretended to focus on making coffee. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't even the fact that he'd gone out. People take late walks. People can't sleep. That's normal. What wasn't normal was lying about something that harmless. The ease of it. The calmness. It made my skin crawl. All day I debated what to do. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I'd always been a little too sensitive when it came to him. Maybe this was confirmation bias. I expected something off, so I was finding it. I tried to convince myself of two possibilities. Either something was happening and he had a reason not to share it, or this was just his business and I needed to let it go. But that night, it happened again. This time I didn't hesitate. The moment he stepped outside, I followed. I kept my distance. I've always been good at going unnoticed. Even as a kid, I was the quiet one, the observer. So I moved carefully, just enough to keep track of him without giving myself away. We didn't walk far, 15 minutes at most. Then I saw him step into a hunter's cabin. I don't know what I had expected. Honestly, I think my mind had been cycling through a dozen scenarios. None of them ended with him calmly entering a structure in the woods at 3 in the morning. I stood there for a moment, watching. But then, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I turned around and went back. On the way back, and as I walked into the cabin, I felt awful. Not just tired, but drained, like something had been siphoned out of me. I blamed the lack of sleep, the hiking, the drinking. So I just went back to bed, and didn't wake up until after 1 in the afternoon, when someone knocked on my door asking if I planned on joining the living. I dragged myself out of bed with a lot of effort and stumbled out of the room, still dizzy. When I went downstairs, I noticed something strange. We all looked tired. Not normal tired, but we all looked slightly yellowish, and the only one who actually seemed healthy was Michael. One of the guys, John, ended up throwing up. We had a hike planned, but suddenly nobody seemed too eager. Still, we didn't want to waste the day sitting inside. That's what we'd come here for. Fresh air and time together. That's when I made a decision. I was going to create an opportunity in that moment. I suggested we take a shorter hike. Said there was a nearby route I wanted to try. Obviously, that was a lie. There wasn't an official trail there, but it would take us right past the hunter's cabin. When Michael heard where I wanted to go, he immediately said there was no trail there. I insisted that I was pretty sure there was, so I pushed harder than I normally would have. I told myself it was casual curiosity, but if I'm being honest, I was already obsessed. I needed to see how he'd react. We walked out together. I lagged behind the group because I genuinely felt sick. As we approached the area near the cabin, we veered slightly off so it wouldn't look too obvious. That's when Michael slowed down and matched my pace. He told me he knew exactly what I was doing. He made it clear that if I cared about the well-being of the group, I should drop it, leave him alone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It sounded like a threat. In that moment, I knew he suspected I'd followed him. And that terrified me more than anything else. Because now it wasn't just curiosity. Now it was something he felt protective over. We went back to the cabin early. Everyone felt worse as the day went on. That night, I actually slept. Mostly because my body didn't give me a choice. But the next morning, it was obvious we were sick. All of us looked more yellow, sweaty, and weak. Even Michael claimed to feel symptoms, though he didn't look nearly as bad as the rest of us. He was steady on his feet and alert. He insisted it was probably something we'd eaten. Encouraged us to stay the rest of the week. But the more he pushed for that, the more something inside me screamed that we needed to leave. I didn't want to accuse him. Group dynamics are fragile. One wrong word and everything fractures. So I kept it neutral. Suggested that maybe it was food poisoning, and that the smart thing would be to head back and at least get checked out. But the second I mentioned the hospital, he pushed back. And right then, John nearly collapsed. Fortunately, that settled it. We packed up, despite Michael's visible frustration, and drove back. We took John straight to the hospital. His tests came back, showing signs of poisoning. Not mild food poisoning, something chemical, something that shouldn't have been in his system. That's when the rest of us decided to get tested too. Every single one of us had traces of poison in our bodies. But the thing is, we didn't compare paperwork. We didn't hold the results up side by side. We just believed each other when we said the same thing. The doctors had found something that didn't belong there. And suddenly, those late-night walks into the woods didn't feel mysterious anymore. They felt deliberate. Ever since that week, I haven't been able to shake the way Michael looked at me in the hospital waiting room. While the rest of the guys were distracted, talking to nurses or scrolling through their phones, I kept catching him staring, not confused, not worried, just watching me. There was something openly hostile in it, like he knew I had figured out more than I was supposed to. Over the past year, I've replayed everything more times than I can count. The late-night walks, the hunter's cabin, the way we all got sick except him, the way he pushed so hard for us to stay, the way he immediately resisted the hospital. None of it feels accidental, and I don't believe for a second it was some kind of twisted joke. You don't casually poison 5 people as a prank. Whatever he was doing out there, whatever was in that cabin, I'm convinced we interrupted something. I've gone back and forth about what to do. For months, I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe it really was contaminated food. But the more distance I've had from it, the clearer it feels. There are too many coincidences stacked on top of each other. The part that's been eating at me is the silence. It's been a year, and I haven't said anything beyond that hospital visit. None of us filed a report. None of us questioned the cabin. We just went back to our separate lives, scattered across different states, back to jobs and routines and normality. On paper, it looks like an unfortunate trip where we got sick, but I don't think that's what it was. And lately the guilt has been getting heavier. Because if I'm right, then staying quiet doesn't just protect the group's peace. It protects him. It gives him space to do it again. Maybe not to us. Maybe to someone else who rents that same cabin. Someone who doesn't catch on. Someone who doesn't make it to a hospital in time. The worst-case scenario for me speaking up is that I fracture whatever remains of that old friendship. But the truth is, that bond barely exists anymore. We don't live in the Smokies. We don't see each other regularly. The nostalgia of childhood is not a good enough reason to ignore something potentially criminal. I've thought about calling each of them individually, telling them plainly that I don't think what happened was accidental. Asking them to look back at the timeline, at Michael's behavior, at the way he reacted when the hospital was mentioned. I've also thought about going straight to the police and filing a report, even if it's late. Telling them about the cabin, about the poisoning results. Letting them decide whether it's worth investigating him or that property. Because here's the thing. If I stay quiet and something worse happens down the line, I'll carry that too. So, I guess this is my first step. Saying it out loud. Putting it into words instead of keeping it locked in my head. Admitting that I don't think we were just unlucky. I think something happened up there. Something deliberate. And I think I've been afraid to face what that means. The next step is harder. But I already know what it has to be.